My name is Gladys Powell. I was 34 years old, 3 days postpartum, and bleeding through a hospital gown when my mother-in-law walked into my recovery room and tried to buy my newborn twins for $22 million. Welcome to Olivia Stories Revenge. If you have ever had a family member look you in the eye and try to put a price tag on your dignity, you are in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me your age and where you are listening from, and please hit that subscribe button. The room smelled of iodine and stale apple juice. Bismarck, North Dakota in February is relentless, and the hospital radiator hissed a constant dry heat against the window. Victoria Sterling walked in first. She is a regional commercial real estate magnate, a woman who wears tailored wool suits like armor. She did not look at the plastic bassinets where my newborn son and daughter were sleeping. She marched straight to my bed and dropped a heavy manila folder onto my tray table. The thick paper slapped against the plastic surface. Julian, my husband of 4 years, shuffled into the room behind her. He kept his eyes locked on the scuffed linoleum floor, his shoulders hunched. Then came Blair. Blair was 24. She smelled like expensive vanilla perfume, the heavy kind that coats the back of your throat. As she crossed her arms, the fluorescent hospital lights caught the diamond tennis bracelet on her left wrist. My tennis bracelet, the exact one that went missing from my bedroom vanity 3 months ago. Victoria did not offer a greeting. She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the folder. "Open it, Gladys," she said. Her voice was flat and commanding, the exact tone she used to crush competitors in zoning meetings. I slid the folder open. Inside sat 2 documents, a cashier check made out to me for $22 million, and a full relinquishment of parental rights. Julian finally looked up. He swallowed hard, avoiding my gaze. "Glad, just take it," he whispered. "Mom is being generous. We can all just move on." "Move on?" I repeated. My voice sounded hollow, scraping against my dry throat. Blair let out a sharp, impatient sigh. "Look, you are clearly overwhelmed," she said, leaning against the sink. "Julian and I have the space. Victoria has the staff. You can go start over somewhere warm. Just sign the papers." I looked down at the check. $22 million. Most people would scream. Most people would throw the water pitcher at their heads or mash the nurse call button to call security. But I am a senior commercial escrow auditor. I spend my life tracking high-yield liquidity and corporate asset structuring. I looked at the routing numbers on the bottom of the check. I recognized the banking institution immediately. Victoria had not pulled this from a liquid cash account. She had leveraged it against her flagship commercial properties. Victoria leaned over the bed, invading my space. "I only want the kids, Gladys. Take the money and walk away, or my lawyers will tie you up in family court until you cannot afford to buy a single box of diapers." My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline spike of absolute clarity. I reached for the plastic pen resting on the tray. I did not argue. I did not cry. I flipped to the signature page. I read the strict non-revocation clause Victoria had so carefully inserted to trap me. She wanted to ensure I could never back out. Then I signed my name, exactly where she pointed. Blair smiled a thin, victorious curve of her lips. Victoria snatched the folder back, nodded once to Julian, and they walked out, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the heart monitor. They thought they had won. They thought I was a broken, terrified woman who had just sold her soul for a payout. They did not realize they had just handed a seasoned financial auditor the exact legal mechanism needed to freeze a real estate empire. By midnight, the hospital corridor was silent. I had already called a private medical transport company. I packed my hospital bag. I bundled my twins into their car seats. We slipped out the side exit into the freezing North Dakota night, carrying a $22 million check that was about to balance my mother-in-law's net worth to absolute zero. The medical transport van tires hummed a low, steady rhythm against the frozen asphalt of Interstate 94. Inside the modified cabin, the air was thick with the scent of sterile antiseptic wipes and the faint metallic tang of the heavy-duty heater working overtime against the brutal North Dakota winter night. My newborn son and daughter slept deeply in their secured medical bassinets, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect unison, oblivious to the chaos we had just left behind. I sat directly across from them, with a secure, encrypted laptop resting heavy on my knees. The harsh blue light of the screen illuminated my exhausted face, but my hands did not shake. I was no longer a terrified woman recovering from a grueling delivery. I was a senior commercial escrow auditor, and I had monumental work to do before the sun came up. To understand the sheer magnitude of the trap Victoria Sterling willingly walked into, you have to understand exactly how she built her regional kingdom. Victoria did not build Sterling Commercial Properties with her own liquid cash. She constructed her massive real estate empire entirely on aggressive, highly leveraged commercial debt. She acquired sprawling strip malls, towering downtown office complexes, and massive industrial parks by constantly borrowing against the inflated equity of her previous purchases. It is a precarious financial house of cards that requires constant fluid capital and pristine banking relationships to maintain. Julian, my husband, was never a true partner in her empire. He was merely her spineless heir, a man who wore very expensive custom suits and attended board meetings, but never made a single executive decision without his mother nodding her absolute approval first. When Julianne proposed to me 4 years ago, I mistakenly thought he was just a quiet, gentle man, horribly overshadowed by a domineering parent. I was completely wrong. He was entirely complicit in her cruelty. The week before our wedding, Victoria summoned me to her downtown Bismarck corner office. The room smelled of expensive imported leather and intimidating generational wealth. She slid a dense 70-page prenuptial agreement across her massive mahogany desk. The document was a masterpiece of financial aggression, meticulously designed to ensure that, if the marriage ever dissolved, I would walk away completely penniless, stripped of all marital assets, and legally barred from seeking any form of spousal support. She pointed to the signature line with a heavy gold fountain pen and coldly told me that signing it was the only way I would ever be allowed to join her family. The fatal flaw in Victoria's grand design was her own towering arrogance. She looked at my modest sedan, my quiet demeanor, and my sensible wardrobe, and she incorrectly assumed I was financially illiterate. She saw my job title and dismissed me as a glorified bank teller. She never bothered to realize that commercial escrow auditors do not just count pennies in a ledger. We mathematically dissect complex corporate architectures. We are the precise analytical people who hunt down hidden leverage, find the buried collateral, and catch greedy billionaires trying to outsmart federal banking regulations. That massive, arrogant assumption was the exact reason she felt completely confident dropping a $22 million cashier check directly onto my hospital bed. She truly believed the sight of so many zeros would blind me with greed and panic. But when I looked at that piece of paper, I immediately saw the specific routing and account numbers printed along the bottom edge. Those funds were not sitting idle in a basic checking account waiting to be spent on luxury vacations. That immense amount of capital was directly leveraged against her most valuable flagship commercial real estate properties. By aggressively forcing me to execute that specific check while simultaneously demanding my signature on her customized relinquishment documents, Victoria unknowingly legally triggered a devastating commercial liquidity covenant. A liquidity covenant is a strict, unforgiving banking mechanism that legally requires a corporate borrower to maintain a massive minimum cash reserve at all times. If that specific reserve is suddenly drained or transferred outside the approved corporate structure, the lending banks immediately freeze the overarching accounts to prevent total corporate insolvency. As the transport van sped relentlessly toward the Canadian border, I logged into my secure federal banking portal using a randomized digital private network. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced, ruthless precision. I did not deposit the $22 million into my personal bank account. Doing that would have been a catastrophic amateur mistake. That is exactly what a victim would do. Doing that would have allowed her high-priced corporate lawyers to immediately freeze my personal assets by claiming I extorted her under medical duress. Instead, I executed a highly complex sequence of legal financial transfers, utilizing the very documents she forced me to sign in that hospital room. I routed the entire massive sum directly into an impenetrable, generation-skipping, irrevocable federal trust. I legally named my newborn twins as the sole exclusive beneficiaries of the massive fortune. And for the ultimate masterstroke, I legally named Victoria Sterling Corporate Holding Entity as the permanent financial guarantor of the entire trust. I weaponized her own meticulous legal paperwork to permanently bind her wealth to my children. The immediate fallout began the very next morning, shortly after sunrise. Through the high-definition security cameras I had secretly installed in the vaulted ceilings of our primary residence, I watched the initial conflict unfold in real time. The sprawling 5-bedroom estate located in the most affluent subdivision of Bismarck sat completely silent. I had spent the last 3 months anticipating this exact betrayal, slowly shipping my personal belongings, clothing, and sensitive documents to a secure remote storage facility, while meticulously leaving the main house looking perfectly normal and lived in. At exactly 8 in the morning, a sleek, black, luxury sport utility vehicle aggressively pulled into the wide circular driveway. Victoria stepped out, wearing a sharp charcoal trench coat, her designer heels clicking sharply against the icy pavement. Julian trailed several feet behind her, looking pale, anxious, and completely exhausted. They unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the grand marble foyer, fully expecting to find a broken, weeping woman desperate to hand over her children and beg for forgiveness. Instead, they found stripped walk-in closets, empty nursery dressers, and a haunting, echoing silence. The massive house was entirely void of my existence. Victoria marched heavily into the massive gourmet kitchen. Her frantic, sharp eyes scanned the pristine white marble countertops. Sitting perfectly centered on the massive granite island was a single, crisp white envelope. I watched through the encrypted camera feed as she snatched the envelope and ripped it open with violent force. Julian hovered nervously over her shoulder, his hands buried deep in his expensive coat pockets, shifting his weight from side to side. Inside the envelope was not a tearful goodbye letter or a desperate plea for a second chance. It was a simple, automated banking printout, documenting a finalized receipt of deposit. The ceiling camera captured the exact second Victoria realized the sheer magnitude of her catastrophic miscalculation. Her rigid posture stiffened even further, the color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very frail. She dropped the piece of paper onto the granite counter as if it had physically burned her fingers. She reached for her cell phone with visibly trembling hands, frantically dialing her corporate finance director. Even without a live audio feed, I knew exactly what her panicked finance director was telling her on the other end of that secure line. The major conflict had fundamentally shifted beneath her feet. Victoria realized the massive sum of money was not just physically gone. It was legally locked away behind ironclad federal trust regulations, entirely out of her reach, and heavily guarded by federal banking laws. But because my strategic filing legally named her holding company as the irrevocable guarantor, her entire network of corporate accounts was automatically paralyzed by the banking system. The lending institutions had electronically flagged the massive overnight transfer. Pending a mandatory, rigorous federal escrow verification process, every single dollar associated with Sterling Commercial Properties was frozen solid. She could not process weekly payroll, she could not collect commercial tenant rent, and she could not access a single dime of her vast personal wealth. Victoria violently slammed her phone against the granite countertop, shattering the glass screen into dozens of jagged pieces. Julian flinched, stepping backward, away from her radiating fury. The wealthy, untouchable matriarch of North Dakota real estate was suddenly trapped inside a restrictive financial cage of her own arrogant making. But Victoria was not the only person about to realize the empire was rapidly crumbling to dust. Back in her downtown luxury condominium, Blair was currently waking up eagerly anticipating a morning of playing wealthy stepmother to my stolen children. She was fully expecting to celebrate her victory with an unlimited shopping spree. She was about to brutally discover that a frozen corporate account meant her glamorous, subsidized lifestyle was officially canceled without warning. And an angry, entitled mistress without a functioning credit card is a very dangerous, volatile liability. 200 miles north of the Bismarck city limits, the landscape transforms into an endless expanse of brutal white snow and towering black pines. My sanctuary was a heavily insulated, off-grid cabin situated entirely off the main county roads. The air outside was cold enough to crack engine blocks, but inside the heavy timber walls, the environment was perfectly controlled. A cast-iron wood stove radiated deep, penetrating heat. In the corner of the main living area, a stack of encrypted servers hummed a steady, low-frequency rhythm. Their blinking green indicator lights cast faint rhythmic shadows across the thick wool rug, where my twins slept securely in their portable cribs. I sat at a heavy oak dining table, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the digital fallout of my disappearance propagate across the secure monitors. While I enjoyed the profound silence of the northern wilderness, a completely different reality was crashing down on my husband and his mistress. Blair was a 24-year-old former staging assistant who had met Julian while picking out imported Italian porcelain tiles for one of Victoria Residential lobby renovations. She possessed a very specific type of superficial ambition. Blair had looked at Julian and incorrectly equated his inherited platinum credit cards with actual personal power. She viewed my newborn twins not as human beings requiring constant devotion, but as highly lucrative accessories. To Blair, those babies were golden tickets, meticulously designed to permanently cement her status within the wealthy family dynamic. She expected to wake up that morning as a triumphant, conquering stepmother, ready to parade stolen infants around the country club while spending my hush money. Instead, she woke up to a catastrophic reality check. The minor conflict ignited when Blair attempted to purchase a highly extravagant vintage nursery set from an exclusive online boutique based in Paris. She confidently typed in the corporate card number Julian had given her months ago. The computer screen flashed a bright red error message. Transaction declined. She tried a second card. Declined. She tried a third. The screen locked her out completely, citing a comprehensive federal hold on the overarching commercial account. The financial paralysis I engineered the night before was actively suffocating her subsidized lifestyle. Furious that there were no babies to play house with and absolutely no money to fund her luxury shopping habits, Blair threw a violent tantrum inside the downtown condominium. Julian was completely useless, pacing the hardwood floors and anxiously chewing his fingernails. Because Blair fundamentally lacked any genuine understanding of complex corporate finance, she mistakenly believed this was a simple, temporary glitch. She decided she could fix the problem by forcefully bringing the children back. In her deeply flawed logic, securing the twins would immediately appease Victoria and magically unfreeze the endless river of cash. Determined to bully her way to victory, Blair bypassed Julianne completely and marched directly into the sleek, glass-walled offices of Victoria Primary Corporate Legal Team. This decision was the monumental misstep I had been patiently waiting for. Blair demanded the attorneys file an aggressive emergency custody petition immediately. She instructed them to formally claim that I had maliciously kidnapped the infants in the middle of the night. The attorneys, hesitant but highly pressured by the presence of the boss' future daughter-in-law, drafted the expedited paperwork. The fatal pebble of this entire endeavor was Blair's profound legal ignorance. To expedite the emergency petition and force a judge to issue an immediate nationwide Amber Alert, Blair was required to submit a sworn legal affidavit. She sat in a plush leather chair, drank sparkling water, and carelessly signed a legally binding document stating she was the primary daily caregiver for the infants, and that my sudden departure posed an imminent physical threat to their well-being. Because Victoria Primary Legal Team was actually headquartered across the border in neighboring Minnesota, the attorneys filed the emergency injunction in a federal district court to ensure maximum jurisdictional reach. They thought they were being highly strategic. In reality, they were sealing their own doom. By knowingly signing a fraudulent document and filing it across state lines, utilizing a corporate entity, Blair unknowingly upgraded a messy domestic dispute into a heavily penalized case of federal perjury. Sitting in my cabin, I received an automated ping on my encrypted laptop. I had previously set up a dark web scraper program specifically designed to monitor multiple regional court dockets for my name. The PDF of the emergency petition downloaded onto my screen. I read the sworn affidavit, and a cold, analytical smile spread across my face. As a senior commercial escrow auditor, I spend my professional life destroying liars with their own documentation. I did not need to hire an expensive defense attorney to fight this battle. I simply needed to present the irrefutable chronological facts. Before I left the hospital, I had legally requested a comprehensive copy of my own medical file, including the time-stamped visitor logs and the electronic surveillance footage from the maternity ward hallway. It is a standard patient right that no one ever thinks to utilize. I compiled these files into a heavily encrypted digital dossier. I drafted a brief, highly professional email addressed directly to the federal family court magistrate assigned to the emergency petition. I attached Blair's sworn affidavit claiming to be the primary daily caregiver. Right next to it, I attached the high-definition hospital security footage from exactly 3 days prior. The video clearly showed a heavily perfumed Blair walking into my recovery room for the very first time, completely ignoring the sleeping infants and impatiently tapping her foot while Victoria aggressively demanded my signature on the hush money contract. I also attached the attending physician notes, proving I had just undergone a grueling delivery and had never once left the hospital premises prior to my legal discharge. The magistrate received my email precisely 20 minutes before the emergency hearing was scheduled to commence in Minneapolis. The reaction was swift and absolutely devastating. Family court judges possess a terrifying lack of patience for wealthy individuals who attempt to weaponize the legal system using blatant fabrications. The judge took the bench, held up the printed affidavit, and ruthlessly tore into Victoria corporate attorneys. The magistrate did not just immediately throw out the frivolous kidnapping petition. The judge formally sanctioned the entire law firm for submitting unverified, perjured testimony to a federal court and forwarded the underlying documentation to the district attorney office for a potential criminal perjury investigation regarding Blair. The news of the severe judicial sanctions reached Victoria exactly 1 hour later. She was standing in her corner office, already drowning in a sea of frozen assets and panicked phone calls from her accounting department. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Blair was not just a naive, annoying girl her son enjoyed sleeping with. Blair was a massive, radioactive, legal liability who had just permanently destroyed the Sterling family credibility in federal court. Julian found himself completely trapped in a suffocating crossfire. He stood in the center of the corporate boardroom, listening to his mother scream that his foolish mistress was going to get them all indicted. Simultaneously, his cell phone vibrated relentlessly in his pocket, with frantic text messages from Blair, demanding to know why the police had not yet been dispatched to find her stolen babies. He had absolutely nowhere to hide. Victoria ordered her security team to block Blair from ever entering the corporate building again. She attempted to pivot her attention back to the catastrophic financial freeze, bleeding her company dry. But the consequences of my hospital departure were multiplying faster than she could possibly manage. The banks had finally finished analyzing the $22 million trust transfer, and because Victoria corporate accounts were completely paralyzed, she was about to receive a notification that terrifies even the most ruthless real estate moguls. The lenders were preparing to demand their money. The digital clock on my encrypted laptop glowed a soft blue, indicating it was just past 3 in the afternoon. Outside the thick, reinforced glass of my remote cabin, a fierce North Dakota blizzard whipped snow through the towering pine trees. Inside, the environment was quiet and perfectly warm. I sat in a comfortable rocking chair, feeding my infant daughter, while my son slept soundly in the bassinet beside me. With my free hand, I navigated the secure financial portals on my screen, watching the devastating architecture of my mother-in-law, impending ruin, activate exactly as I had calculated. To the average person, banking happens in days. You deposit a check and wait for the funds to clear. But in the rarefied atmosphere of high-level corporate commercial real estate finance, capital moves instantaneously through automated clearinghouses governed by ruthless mathematical algorithms. When I routed that massive $22 million sum into the newly established irrevocable trust, the sheer size of the transaction triggered an immediate automated review by the primary lending institution backing Sterling commercial properties. Those algorithms are entirely devoid of emotion. They do not care about Victoria's sterling wealthy reputation or her designer suits. They only care about ratios. And the ratio of her liquid capital to her outstanding corporate debt had just suffered a catastrophic, fatal plummet. Every single massive skyscraper and sprawling retail complex Victoria owned was financed through a delicate web of commercial mortgages. Those specific loans contained strict liquidity covenants, dictating that she must maintain a massive pile of accessible cash on hand at all times to prove she can cover market fluctuations. By guaranteeing the trust with her corporate holding company, I effectively tied an anvil to her balance sheet and pushed it off a financial cliff. Her available cash reserves dropped below the legally mandated threshold. This specific event triggered a financial phenomenon known as a margin call. A margin call is the ultimate nightmare for any leveraged billionaire. It is a formal, aggressively enforced demand from a lending institution requiring the borrower to immediately deposit massive amounts of capital to cover their exposed risk. The notification arrived in Victoria inbox shortly after her disastrous morning at my empty house. Her primary banking syndicate was officially demanding $15 million in liquid cash. They gave her exactly 48 hours to produce the funds. If she failed to comply, they would formally declare her entire corporate portfolio in default and begin seizing her properties one by one. Sitting hundreds of miles away, I watched the real-time digital ledgers update on my screen. I could visualize the absolute terror gripping her corporate headquarters. Desperation forces people into incredibly predictable actions. The minor conflict ignited when Victoria attempted to brutally force the banking system to obey her will. She stormed into the executive branch of her primary lender, located in downtown Bismarck, flanked by her remaining corporate attorneys. She demanded an immediate audience with the regional bank manager. She commanded them to stop the transaction, reverse the routing, and cancel the cashier check immediately. She loudly claimed the funds were stolen, that I had committed fraud, and that the entire transfer was executed under severe medical duress. She expected the bank manager to cower and comply. But corporate banking compliance officers are bound by federal regulations, not local intimidation tactics. The manager calmly pulled up the digital file associated with the massive transfer. To process the transaction, I had uploaded a certified copy of the exact legal contract Victoria had handed me in the hospital recovery room. The banker turned the screen around to face her. He pointed directly to a highly specific, ironclad paragraph buried on page 4. It was a strict non-revocation clause. When Victoria originally hired her aggressive legal team to draft that hospital ambush document, her sole objective was ensuring I could never change my mind. She wanted to guarantee that once I took the hush money, I could never return it and demand my parental rights back. Her lawyers had crafted a masterpiece of restrictive legal jargon, stating that the financial transfer was absolute, irrevocable, and immune to any subsequent claims of duress, coercion, or fraud by either signing party. Victoria stared at the screen, realizing the horrifying truth. The exact legal mechanism she designed to trap a vulnerable postpartum mother had become the heavy steel door of her own financial prison. The bank manager politely informed her that because she had signed a contract explicitly waiving her right to contest the funds, the bank was legally prohibited from reversing the transfer. She had built a pristine, razor-sharp financial guillotine and then willingly placed her own neck directly on the block. While Victoria was experiencing total systemic failure at the bank, her son was enduring a complete psychological collapse inside his luxury vehicle. My burner phone, resting quietly on the wooden dining table, began to vibrate. The caller identification displayed Julian private cellular number. I did not answer. I simply let it route directly to the secure voicemail server I had configured. He called again, then again. Over the span of 2 hours, my husband left 13 increasingly frantic audio messages. I downloaded the audio files, observing the jagged digital waveforms on my screen. I pressed play and listened to the spectacular deterioration of a coward. His first few messages were laced with his typical manufactured arrogance. He demanded I answer the phone, insisting this little stunt was going to land me in federal prison. By the 5th voicemail, the false bravado completely evaporated, replaced by a trembling, breathless panic. He begged me to release the funds. He pleaded for a compromise. He promised we could renegotiate the custody arrangement if I just unlocked his mother corporate accounts before the impending margin call deadline expired. But it was the 11th voicemail that delivered the most magnificent strategic prize. Julian was weeping openly into the receiver, the sound of busy traffic rushing past his windshield. His voice cracked as he threw his entire family under the bus, hoping to save himself. He confessed everything. He admitted on the recorded line that Victoria had forcefully orchestrated the entire hospital ambush. But the true revelation, the shocking twist that perfectly explained the rushed, sloppy nature of their plan, involved Blair. Julian tearfully confessed that his young, arrogant mistress was actively blackmailing him. For the past 2 years, Julian had been secretly embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his mother corporate accounts to fund Blair's lavish lifestyle, her designer wardrobe, her luxury vacations, and the missing diamond tennis bracelet. Blair had recently discovered the true source of her allowance. She threatened to march directly to Victoria and expose his massive corporate theft, unless he divorced me, secured full custody of the twins, and provided her with a massive permanent payout. The hospital ambush was never just about Victoria wanting control of her grandchildren. It was a desperate, terrified cover-up, orchestrated by a son terrified of his mother's wrath and a mistress eager to secure her stolen fortune. I paused the recording and took a slow, deep breath. The smell of burning pine wood from the stove filled my lungs. I meticulously archived the audio files, backing them up to 3 separate secure cloud locations. I did not need to scream at him or hire a private investigator to dig up their dirty secrets. Every panicked move they made, every frantic phone call they placed, delivered a new weapon directly into my hands. I was tightening the noose around their collective necks without speaking a single word. The Sterling family was rapidly cannibalizing itself. The mother was facing total corporate annihilation. The son was facing exposure for massive embezzlement. The mistress was facing the total loss of her blackmailed fortune. They were cornered, desperate, and rapidly running out of legitimate legal options. And when arrogant, wealthy individuals realize the law will no longer protect their interests, they inevitably turn to illicit, criminal methods. Victoria realized she could not bully the banks, and she could not legally reverse the trust. She decided her only remaining option was to physically find me and force me to undo the damage. She was about to deploy significant resources to hunt me down, utilizing aggressive cyber intrusion to track my digital footprint. But she was severely underestimating the fact that a skilled auditor always leaves a highly specific, entirely fake paper trail to trap a predator. The 48-hour deadline imposed by the banking syndicate hung over Victoria like a suspended, heavy anvil. As the hours evaporated, her legitimate avenues of survival rapidly slammed shut. I knew exactly how women like my mother-in-law operated when the sterile light of the courtroom abandoned them. They retreat into the shadows. They leverage their vast wealth to hire the kind of people who do not carry briefcases or file motions. Victoria was completely cornered, and a cornered predator always resorts to brute force. She authorized a staggering expenditure to deploy a private intelligence firm. This was a massive escalation, stepping far outside the boundaries of civil litigation and violently crossing into aggressive cyber intrusion. She wanted to physically locate me, retrieve the twins, and force me to undo the financial apocalypse I had initiated. But a skilled commercial auditor never leaves a true footprint. We leave precisely calibrated decoys. I had anticipated her ruthless escalation months before I ever went into labor. Before the hospital ambush, before I even finalized my emergency transport, I meticulously engineered a digital breadcrumb designed to look exactly like the desperate mistake of a fleeing woman. I established an anonymous shell company in the state of Delaware. Delaware is notorious for its impenetrable corporate secrecy laws, making it the perfect canvas for my snare. I named the phantom entity Horizon Logistics and classified it as an elite, high-security relocation service. Then I executed a highly visible transaction. I wired exactly $12,500 from a minor secondary bank account directly to the Delaware entity. I explicitly tagged the routing memo with the phrase expedited residential extraction and secure housing retainer. It was an irresistible piece of bait resting in the center of a very dark digital forest. Sitting in my secure cabin watching the thick snow accumulate against the reinforced window panes, I monitored the customized server I had built specifically to host the Delaware Shell Company. The server was essentially a digital honeypot, a fake infrastructure designed to look like a vulnerable administrative database. I did not have to wait long. Shortly after dinner time, my encrypted monitor began flashing a steady, rhythmic warning sequence. Someone was aggressively attempting to breach the Delaware server firewall. Victoria had unleashed her corporate intelligence team. Her hackers were frantically trying to penetrate the fake relocation service, hoping to find a hidden client ledger, a physical destination address, or any geographical coordinate that would lead her private investigators to my front door. They thought they were being exceptionally stealthy. They were entirely wrong. As they violently hammered against the artificial firewall, my customized tracing software quietly slipped around their connection and illuminated their exact origin point. The incoming Internet Protocol addresses cascaded down my screen in bright green text. I did not just block them. I welcomed them in just far enough to capture their undeniable digital fingerprints. The addresses did not route back to some anonymous coffee shop or a hidden overseas server. In her blind, raging panic, Victoria had commanded her intelligence team to operate directly out of her own corporate headquarters in downtown Bismarck. She used the dedicated static network assigned exclusively to Sterling Commercial Properties. I documented every single illegal packet of data they transmitted. I generated comprehensive forensic logs proving their structural intrusion. By authorizing this specific hack, Victoria violently crossed a massive, unforgiving legal line. Unauthorized access to a federally protected commercial financial institution is a severe felony, carrying devastating, mandatory federal prison sentences. I bundled the forensic evidence into a secure, encrypted file, locking it away for the precise moment I needed to destroy her completely. While Victoria was busy committing federal cybercrimes, her son and his mistress were rapidly discovering the true extent of their own misery. Through my ongoing surveillance of Julian frozen financial assets, I observed a highly entertaining secondary conflict unraveling in real time. Blair had finally realized the Sterling empire was actively sinking. The unlimited credit cards were useless. The luxury condominium was suddenly feeling like a very expensive trap. Driven by her insatiable greed and a complete lack of loyalty, the mistress decided to liquidate her assets before the ship completely submerged beneath the waves. Blair gathered the extravagant jewelry Julianne had purchased for her, including the stolen diamond tennis bracelet, and marched into a highly exclusive estate liquidator in neighboring Minnesota. She confidently placed the velvet boxes on the appraisal counter, demanding an immediate, exorbitant cash payout. She thought she was being incredibly cunning, but she was severely lacking in basic financial literacy. The liquidator carefully examined the pieces and ran the required background checks on the original purchase certificates. The system immediately flagged the items. Because Julian had purchased those specific diamonds using embezzled funds directly tied to Victoria-paralyzed corporate accounts, the jewelry was legally classified as disputed corporate assets, currently locked under federal banking review. The estate liquidator did not hand Blair a stack of $100 bills. He confiscated the jewelry, locked it in a secure, heavy vault, and calmly informed her that he was legally obligated to report the attempted sale of frozen corporate collateral to the financial authorities. Blair stormed out of the boutique, completely empty-handed and absolutely enraged. She called Julian screaming into the phone, realizing the wealthy man she thought she had conquered was completely broke and under active investigation. The glamorous fantasy she had violently tried to steal from me was disintegrating into a terrifying legal nightmare. The pawn was finally turning on the king, recognizing that her promised kingdom was nothing but an illusion. The pressure crushing Victoria was now arriving from 3 distinct, ruthless directions. Her commercial banks were actively preparing the paperwork to seize her sprawling real estate portfolio due to the unresolved $15 million margin call. Her spineless son was collapsing under the weight of his exposed embezzlement and the escalating demands of his increasingly hostile mistress. And entirely unknown to her, she had just handed me irrefutable forensic evidence of a massive federal cybercrime. She was drowning in a turbulent ocean of her own arrogant creation. But a woman who has spent 4 decades crushing her enemies under the weight of her immense wealth does not simply surrender when she is cornered. When her hackers failed to locate my physical address and her bankers refused to return her stolen liquidity, Victoria realized she needed to fundamentally rewrite reality itself. If she could not find the twins, she decided she would simply legally erase my fundamental right to exist as their mother. She was about to execute the most audacious, reckless, and easily disproven lie of her entire miserable life, forcing the conflict onto a brand new battlefield she could never possibly win. The encrypted monitor sitting on my rustic oak dining table chimed with a soft, singular tone. Outside the cabin, the North Dakota blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a blinding expanse of pristine, undisturbed snow that stretched all the way to the Canadian border. Inside, the only sound was the gentle crackle of burning cedar from the cast-iron stove. I set my coffee mug down and focused my attention on the screen. The automated legal scraper program I designed had just flagged a brand new filing in the North Dakota Supreme Court docket. I leaned forward and opened the digital portable document format. The title, centered boldly at the top of the first page, read, Retroactive Gestational Surrogacy Agreement. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the document was staggering. Victoria had actually filed a sworn legal contract claiming I was never the true mother of my newborn twins. The fraudulent paperwork explicitly stated that I was merely a compensated vessel, an incubator hired to carry the biological material of my husband Julian and his young mistress Blair. According to this newly discovered contract, I had willingly surrendered all parental rights long before the children were ever born in exchange for a generous financial stipend. It was a breathtaking escalation. Desperation breeds catastrophic mistakes, and Victoria had just birthed a monster. She realized the banking syndicate was going to seize her properties, and she knew her hackers had failed to locate my physical coordinates. So she decided to fundamentally rewrite reality itself. She believed that if she could present a signed contract to a sympathetic judge, she could legally compel law enforcement to hunt me down as a kidnapper holding stolen property. But Victoria made the fatal error of challenging a senior commercial escrow auditor to a paperwork war. My entire professional existence revolves around verifying the absolute authenticity of complex legal documents. I do not read the narrative of a contract. I read the structural integrity of its creation. I expanded the document on my high-resolution monitor, magnifying the image by 400%. I scrolled past the dense paragraphs of legal fiction describing my supposed compensation and zeroed in on the final signature page. I stared at the bottom right corner where the notary public block sat. That was the first pebble, the tiny, seemingly insignificant flaw that would bring her mountain crashing down. The embossed notary seal belonged to a man named Gregory. I knew Gregory. He was a mid-level administrative assistant working on the 4th floor of Sterling Commercial Properties. He wore cheap polyester suits and possessed a nervous habit of clicking his ballpoint pen during staff meetings. Victoria kept him on the corporate payroll specifically because his notary license allowed her to expedite real estate closings without hiring an external third party. The document stated it was executed and formally notarized on October 12th of the previous year. I opened a separate encrypted folder on my desktop and pulled up my personal medical records. I did not need to guess where I was on October 12th. I knew exactly where I was. I was exactly 32 weeks pregnant with the twins. My blood pressure had spiked to terrifying lethal levels. I had been rushed via ambulance to Bismarck General Hospital and immediately admitted to the intensive care unit for severe preeclampsia. I spent that entire specific day strapped to a terrifying array of fetal heart monitors with an intravenous drip of magnesium sulfate burning through my veins to prevent imminent seizures. The hospital visitor logs proved I was isolated in the critical care ward. The attending physician notes confirmed I was physically incapacitated, drifting in and out of consciousness. I was fundamentally incapable of holding a glass of water, let alone sitting in a downtown corporate boardroom, steadily signing a complex surrogacy agreement in front of a notary public. Victoria had instructed Gregory to backdate the document, assuming no one would bother to check my calendar. It was a remarkably sloppy error, born of blinding arrogance. But the true masterpiece of her demise was the signature itself. I isolated the image of my supposed signature on the surrogacy contract. A human signature is a living, breathing thing. It changes slightly every single time you hold a pen. The angle of the wrist, the speed of the stroke, the pressure applied to the paper, all create microscopic variations. Only a machine produces an exact, identical replica. I opened the digital archive containing the draconian prenuptial agreement Victoria had forced me to sign 4 years prior. I extracted my signature from that old document, layered it over the signature on the new surrogacy contract, and inverted the colors to create a high-contrast visual overlay. It was a pixel-perfect match. Every single loop, every sharp curve, the exact microscopic hesitation on the downward stroke of the letter G in my first name, aligned with terrifying mathematical precision. Victoria had not even attempted to hire a professional forger. She had simply ordered her information technology department to scan the old prenuptial agreement, digitally extract my signature, and paste the artifact directly onto the fabricated surrogacy document. I did not call Victoria to gloat. I did not send a threatening cease and desist letter to her corporate attorneys. Warning your enemy is a courtesy reserved for amateurs. I meticulously compiled an unassailable dossier of destruction. I organized the time-stamped hospital admission records from October 12th. I secured a sworn, certified statement from the intensive care attending physician confirming my total medical incapacitation on that specific date. I generated a comprehensive technical report detailing the digital artifacting and the pixel-identical overlay, proving the signature was a crude electronic lift. I routed this devastating package directly to the white-collar fraud division of the district attorney office, bypassing civil litigation entirely and pushing the conflict straight into the realm of criminal felony prosecution. The minor conflict rippled outward with brutal efficiency the very next morning. The district attorney did not waste time calling the Sterling corporate legal team to politely discuss the discrepancy. They dispatched 2 seasoned criminal investigators directly to the towering glass headquarters of Sterling Commercial Properties. The detectives walked past the sleek marble reception desk, ignored the shouting security guards, and marched straight to the 4th floor administrative sector. They did not ask to speak to Victoria. They asked for Gregory. They pulled the terrified notary out of his cramped cubicle and escorted him into a sterile, windowless interrogation room downtown. Gregory was a man who earned $60,000 a year, had a modest mortgage, and drove a 10-year-old sedan. He possessed absolutely no desire to serve a decade in federal prison to protect the billionaire matriarch who barely remembered his first name. When the detectives placed the time-stamped hospital records and the forged surrogacy document on the metal table, Gregory immediately shattered. The pressure was too immense. He flipped within 10 minutes. He frantically confessed that Victoria had summoned him into her corner office, locked the heavy wooden door, and explicitly threatened to terminate his employment and ruin his professional reputation if he refused to stamp the backdated, fraudulent document. The criminal conspiracy was now officially documented, verified, and recorded by sworn law enforcement personnel. Victoria's attempt to legally erase my motherhood had spectacularly backfired, handing the state prosecutors a textbook case of coercion and forgery. The dominoes were falling with increasing velocity, and the structural integrity of the Sterling family was buckling under the phenomenal weight. With Victoria facing imminent criminal indictment and Blair throwing violent tantrums over frozen credit cards, the suffocating pressure finally broke the weakest link in the chain. Julian was watching his inheritance vanish, his mother commit felonies, and his mistress spiral into venomous rage. He was a profound coward, and cowards invariably seek a place to hide when the battlefield becomes too bloody. Unable to endure the relentless terror of the margin calls and the looming fraud investigation, Julian made a monumental miscalculation. He decided to flee Bismarck and seek refuge. He drove straight toward the city of Fargo, mistakenly assuming I had sought shelter with my only living relative. He was about to walk blindly into a brand new trap, delivering the exact psychological ammunition I needed to permanently bury them all. The psychological architecture of a coward is a fascinating structure to observe from a safe distance. Julian had spent his entire adult existence insulated by layers of inherited privilege and maternal protection. Whenever he made a mistake, Victoria simply wrote a staggering check, and the problem magically vanished. But the insurmountable crisis actively suffocating him now could not be resolved with a quick signature. His mother was currently the prime target of an active felony fraud investigation. His mistress, Blair, was hurling venomous insults at him inside their luxury condominium, furiously demanding the lavish lifestyle he could no longer finance. The commercial lenders were aggressively preparing to dismantle the family real estate portfolio piece by piece. The pristine, invisible shield that had guarded Julian since birth was rapidly disintegrating, leaving him wholly exposed to the terrifying consequences of his own reckless actions. Unable to endure the relentless tension, he did the only thing a weak man knows how to do. He ran. Julian grabbed his keys and drove his expensive imported vehicle out of Bismarck, heading east toward the city of Fargo. He drove recklessly across the frozen, desolate stretches of Interstate 94, blinded by his own mounting panic. He was desperately searching for me. In his limited, unimaginative mind, he logically assumed a terrified postpartum woman would immediately flee to her closest living relative. He believed I was cowering inside the modest suburban home of my older sister, Evelyn. Evelyn is a pragmatic, fiercely protective trauma nurse who possesses absolutely zero tolerance for wealthy bullies. She spends her days stabilizing shattered patients in emergency rooms and has no patience for manufactured drama. I had explicitly warned her about my departure weeks in advance, advising her to lock her doors and activate her external security systems. Julian arrived at Evelyn's quiet neighborhood just as the harsh winter sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long gray shadows across the frozen lawns. He stumbled up the concrete walkway, looking disheveled and entirely unhinged. His expensive cashmere overcoat was heavily wrinkled. His silk tie hung loose around his neck, and his eyes were bloodshot from severe sleep deprivation. He pounded his bare fists against the heavy fiberglass front door. Evelyn was sitting comfortably inside her warm living room drinking herbal tea. She did not unlock the deadbolt. She did not even approach the entryway to look through the glass. Instead, she simply picked up her smartphone and activated the two-way audio and video feature on her high-definition doorbell camera. The small circular lens captured every single pathetic moment of his emotional collapse. Julian stared directly into the glowing blue ring of the camera, genuinely believing Evelyn was standing just on the other side of the wood. He began to weep. The arrogant heir to a colossal commercial real estate empire stood on a frozen concrete porch, sobbing uncontrollably, wiping his running nose on his expensive cashmere sleeve. He begged Evelyn to let him inside, pleading with her to make me reverse the immense financial transfer before he went to federal prison. And then, entirely unprompted, he started confessing. Julian was desperate to paint himself as a helpless victim trapped by his domineering mother. He leaned close to the tiny microphone and spilled every toxic secret they had buried. He admitted on the crystal-clear high-definition recording that Victoria had meticulously planned the entire hospital ambush from the very beginning. He cried out that the $22 million hush money was specifically designed to permanently erase me from the lives of my newborn twins, so Blair could comfortably assume the role of their mother. He blurted out that the surrogacy contract Victoria recently filed with the Supreme Court was a complete fabrication, a desperate lie concocted because they could not physically locate my secure, off-grid cabin. He threw his own mother directly under the crushing wheels of the justice system, hoping to somehow salvage his own miserable skin. Evelyn silently exported the video file and transmitted it to my encrypted server. I sat in my isolated wilderness sanctuary, watching my husband dismantle his own criminal defense in stunning high-resolution video. This specific recording was the ultimate pebble, a piece of undeniable evidentiary concrete that would forever anchor my criminal case against them. I did not need to prove Victoria orchestrated the forgery or that the hospital ambush was a malicious conspiracy. Julian had just provided a sworn, voluntary confession to a recording device completely validating every single allegation I had compiled for the fraud division. While Julian was weeping on a suburban porch, a brand new, monumental conflict was violently erupting inside the towering glass walls of Sterling Commercial Properties. The regional business community is a remarkably small, highly connected ecosystem. Whispers of catastrophic corporate instability spread faster than a winter wildfire. The powerful board of directors overseeing Victoria Holding Company had officially caught wind of the escalating disasters. These were ruthless, pragmatic investors who only cared about quarterly dividends and pristine corporate reputations. They had learned about the terrified notary being hauled into an interrogation room by seasoned criminal detectives. More importantly, they had discovered the immense $22 million liquidity deficit that triggered the terrifying banking margin calls. The board demanded an immediate emergency summit in the primary executive conference room. Victoria walked into the space attempting to project an aura of absolute untouchable authority. She wore her most intimidating tailored suit and carried a thick leather binder. She stood at the head of the massive mahogany table and attempted to aggressively gaslight the room full of seasoned financial executives. She smoothly lied to their faces, claiming the massive deficit was nothing more than a temporary clerical anomaly related to a minor private divorce settlement. She confidently assured the angry shareholders that the frozen funds would be fully restored within the week and dismissed the police presence as a ridiculous misunderstanding blown entirely out of proportion by a disgruntled former employee. Her performance was nearly flawless, a masterful display of sociopathic composure. She might have successfully delayed the corporate mutiny if her son had not returned from his disastrous trip to Fargo, entirely consumed by the fear of incarceration. Julian stumbled back into the corporate headquarters later that evening, reeking of stale sweat and profound terror. He wandered directly into the private office of the chief financial officer, a strict analytical man who had spent the entire day desperately trying to appease the furious lending banks. Julian collapsed into a leather guest chair and began rambling incoherently about federal perjury charges, forged documents, and the terrifying reality that his mother was going to drag him into a concrete prison cell. The chief financial officer listened to the pathetic heir babble about the true nature of the missing $22 million. He realized instantly that Victoria had blatantly lied to the entire board of directors just hours prior. The missing capital was not a clerical error. It was the direct result of a malicious personal vendetta that had now entangled the entire overarching corporate structure in a massive federal criminal investigation. The financial officer immediately drafted a highly confidential memorandum detailing Julian's shocking admissions and transmitted it to the independent chairman of the board. The subsequent explosion of anger within the executive suite tore the company completely apart. A vicious corporate civil war ignited overnight. Half of the executives demanded Victoria resign immediately to protect the remaining assets, while the other half scrambled to hire independent defense counsel to shield themselves from the incoming federal subpoenas. The untouchable matriarch was losing total control of the empire she had ruthlessly ruled for 4 decades. Her authority was crumbling, her wealth was frozen, and her own son had handed her enemies the exact weapons needed to destroy her. But as the corporate structure collapsed inward, a completely different type of threat was rapidly maneuvering through the chaos. Blair, isolated, furious, and totally cut off from the endless river of stolen cash, realized she was about to be discarded like common trash. The ambitious mistress decided if she could not marry into the wealthy dynasty, she would simply extort the remaining pieces, forcing Victoria into a brand new, terrifying confrontation. The collapse of a financial dynasty rarely happens in silence. It usually ends in a loud, violent cacophony of betrayals. For Blair, the realization that her luxurious fantasy was evaporating arrived with cold, brutal clarity. She was entirely cut off from the frozen corporate assets. The designer boutiques no longer welcomed her business. The exclusive downtown condominium felt less like a glamorous palace and more like a beautifully decorated holding cell. Even worse, she was now acutely aware of the looming federal perjury investigation regarding her completely fabricated kidnapping affidavit. She recognized with terrifying certainty that the Sterling family would gladly feed her to the wolves to save their own skin. Blair was not born into wealth. She had clawed her way into high society by meticulously studying the vulnerabilities of rich, powerful men. Julian was her ultimate prize, her golden ticket to an opulent existence. But a parasite cannot survive when the host organism begins to die. If she could not marry the massive fortune, she would simply extract a massive severance package and disappear into the night. I only learned the precise volatile details of this specific confrontation months later while reading through sworn depositions and thick court discovery documents. Blair, dressed in her sharpest winter coat, confidently bypassed the overwhelmed lobby guards stationed at the corporate headquarters. She knew the private executive elevator access codes from her long, scandalous affair with Julian. She marched directly into the sprawling corner office of the matriarch. Victoria was standing by the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, looking incredibly haggard. Her usually flawless posture was slumped under the phenomenal, crushing weight of the incoming banking margin calls, the criminal fraud investigations, and the active boardroom mutiny. Blair did not ask for permission to speak. She slammed her expensive leather handbag onto the polished mahogany desk. She looked the billionaire matriarch directly in the eye and demanded exactly $5 million in untraceable offshore funds. It was a blatant, aggressive extortion play. Blair coldly informed Victoria that she was completely prepared to walk quietly away from the escalating family drama, but her permanent silence carried a very steep price tag. If Victoria refused to pay the severance, Blair promised to march directly to the local investigative press and the regional office of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Blair possessed devastating leverage to back up her threats. During her 2-year clandestine relationship with Julian, he had carelessly bragged about his mother's illicit accounting strategies to impress his young, ambitious mistress. Blair had meticulously saved every single text message, every forwarded corporate email, and every drunken, boastful voicemail. She possessed concrete digital proof demonstrating Victoria's long history of illegally leveraging restricted corporate escrow funds to finance personal luxury acquisitions. She had the exact dates, the hidden account numbers, and the explicit digital conversations, proving massive corporate embezzlement. A rational executive facing total structural annihilation might have attempted to negotiate. A smart woman would have recognized the extreme danger and paid the ransom to eliminate the threat. But Victoria was entirely driven by toxic ego and blinding arrogance. She was the untouchable queen of North Dakota commercial real estate. She absolutely refused to be shaken down or intimidated by a 24-year-old staging assistant she viewed as completely disposable trash. Victoria erupted into a screaming fit of violent, incandescent fury. She slammed her fist onto her desk, hit the emergency panic button hidden underneath the wood, and summoned her private corporate security team. 2 heavily muscled guards burst into the executive suite. Victoria commanded them to physically remove the extortionist from the premises immediately. They grabbed Blair by her arms, dragging her kicking and screaming across the polished marble floors of the executive lobby. They shoved her roughly into the service elevator and forcefully ejected her through the rear loading dock. They threw her out onto the freezing, icy pavement of the downtown alleyway, right next to the industrial garbage receptacles. In her blind, raging fury, Victoria committed a catastrophic tactical error. It was the crucial pebble that would ultimately cause the landslide. Victoria was so entirely focused on the physical humiliation of removing Blair from her sight that she completely forgot to neutralize the actual digital threat. She did not instruct her massive security guards to confiscate the smartphone resting inside the pockets of the mistress. Blair slowly picked herself up from the frozen concrete. Her designer winter coat was torn at the elbow, and her knees were badly bruised from the harsh impact. The humiliation of being tossed into an alleyway like common refuse instantly hardened into pure, vindictive rage. She did not return to the luxury condominium. She did not call Julian for comfort. Blair walked 3 blocks down the frozen city street, marching straight through the heavy glass doors of the state attorney office. She walked right up to the intake desk, slapped her unlocked smartphone onto the counter, and demanded immediate federal whistleblower immunity. Blair voluntarily surrendered 2 entire years of highly incriminating digital communication. The device contained a massive treasure trove of financial corruption, spanning multiple shell companies and illegal ledgers. But far more importantly for my impending custody case, it contained the precise, meticulous planning of the hospital ambush. The surrendered text messages explicitly detailed Victoria instructing Julian to bring the mistress into my recovery room to maximize my emotional distress and force my signature. The digital messages proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the entire $22 million offer was a premeditated, malicious conspiracy designed to permanently steal my newborn twins while I was medically vulnerable. While the matriarch and the mistress were actively destroying each other in downtown Bismarck, I was sitting comfortably in my secure remote wilderness cabin. The fierce winter storm had finally passed, transforming the surrounding pine forest into a silent, breathtaking white wonderland. I sat in a plush armchair positioned right next to the roaring cast-iron fireplace. The heat radiated deeply into my bones, providing a profound sense of comfort. I held my sleeping son securely in my left arm and my sleeping daughter in my right. Their tiny, rhythmic breaths synchronized perfectly with the steady pop and crackle of the burning cedar logs. I looked out at the falling snow, feeling an overwhelming wave of absolute peace wash over me. I had not filed a single civil lawsuit yet. I had not hired an aggressive bulldog attorney to yell in a crowded courtroom. I had not sent a single threatening text message to my husband or my terrifying mother-in-law. I simply engineered the perfect pressurized environment and then stepped completely out of the way. I allowed their natural, inherent toxicity to violently cannibalize their own lives. They were aggressively doing all the heavy lifting for me, dismantling their wealth and their freedom out of sheer arrogance. But the magnificent destruction was not quite complete. Victoria was actively bleeding out from the internal corporate mutiny, the incoming fraud investigations, and the impending securities probe, triggered by the angry mistress. Facing the absolute total loss of her empire, the desperate matriarch was about to attempt one final suicidal maneuver. She foolishly believed she could use her highest executive override codes to unilaterally force the banking system to return the trust money, initiating a massive federal alert that would permanently seal her fate behind iron bars. The silence of a corner office at 3 a.m. is usually a testament to power. For Victoria, it was a profound, suffocating tomb. The monumental 48-hour margin call deadline was rapidly approaching. The sun would rise soon, and when the commercial banking syndicate opened for business, they would formally declare her entire real estate portfolio in default. She had been completely locked out of her own boardroom by mutinous executives. Her legal team had explicitly advised her to surrender. But surrender is a foreign concept to a woman who has spent 4 decades ruling a regional monopoly. Driven into a corner by her own catastrophic failures, the matriarch decided to execute the most dangerous financial maneuver imaginable. She booted up her secure desktop terminal. She bypassed the standard accounting protocols and accessed the legacy banking portal. When Victoria first established Sterling Commercial Properties, she demanded the lending institutions provide her with maximum-level executive override codes. These were highly classified digital keys designed for absolute emergencies, allowing the chief executive officer to forcefully recall capital transfers without requiring secondary authorization from a bank manager. She typed the alphanumeric sequence into the glowing prompt. She selected the exact $22 million transaction I had routed to the irrevocable trust. In the mandatory justification field, she aggressively typed a single phrase: unauthorized, fraudulent extraction. She slammed her finger onto the Enter key. The computer screen processed the command. A green confirmation banner appeared, stating the recall request was successfully transmitted to the automated clearinghouse. Victoria slumped back into her heavy leather executive chair. She poured herself a glass of extremely expensive aged scotch. She took a long, slow sip, genuinely believing she had just forcefully ripped her stolen fortune back from my hands. She thought she had brutally outsmarted me. She had absolutely no idea she had just detonated a federal bomb. Wealthy individuals often suffer from a very specific terminal delusion. They believe their vast fortunes make them completely immune to the rigid systems that govern ordinary citizens. They are accustomed to screaming at bank tellers, threatening branch managers, and leveraging their elite connections to bend the rules. But modern global finance is not controlled by easily intimidated human beings. It is governed by cold, relentless mathematical algorithms. And those algorithms do not answer phone calls from angry billionaires. When I originally engineered the irrevocable trust for my newborn twins, I did not select a local financial institution in North Dakota. I deliberately established the legal entity across state lines in the highly regulated banking jurisdiction of Wyoming. Furthermore, I legally designated 2 infant children as the sole exclusive beneficiaries of the colossal fortune. I knew exactly what would happen if the corporate holding company ever attempted to forcefully claw that money back. The United States Department of the Treasury operates a highly secretive, highly aggressive division known as the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. This agency utilizes incredibly sophisticated software to constantly monitor the national banking grid for specific patterns of illicit behavior. When a massive corporate entity suddenly uses an executive override code to violently recall $22 million from an out-of-state trust belonging to minor children and explicitly flags that transaction as fraudulent, it trips a massive, unassailable alarm. The federal tripwire snapped the very second Victoria pressed the Enter key. The automated clearinghouse did not return the money to her corporate ledger. Instead, the transaction was instantly intercepted and quarantined by the federal algorithms. The system cross-referenced the massive withdrawal attempt with the ongoing internal anomalies bleeding out of Sterling commercial properties. It detected the conflicting documentation, the panicked margin calls, and the completely frozen liquidity status. Within 12 short hours, the situation escalated from a severe civil banking dispute into a full-blown federal criminal emergency. As the morning sun finally crested over the frozen Bismarck skyline, a fleet of dark, unassuming government vehicles quietly surrounded the towering glass headquarters of the real estate empire. The federal agents did not knock. They marched directly into the lobby, presenting warrants to the terrified security staff. The commercial banks had previously frozen Victoria accounts to protect their collateral. That was a civil protective measure. But the federal government executed an absolute asset seizure. The Department of Justice officially locked down every single checking account, savings portfolio, and corporate ledger associated with her name, pending a comprehensive criminal investigation into massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The agents confiscated the hard drives, seized the physical accounting records, and ordered the immediate evacuation of the executive suite. Simultaneously, the Securities and Exchange Commission took devastating, swift action. The regulatory agency issued an emergency halt on all public trading associated with the Sterling Holding Company. On stock exchange monitors across the country, the ticker symbol representing her life work simply stopped moving. The shares were frozen, suspended in a terrifying state of indefinite limbo. The remaining shareholders panicked instantly, realizing their investments were trapped inside a burning building. The complete evaporation of her safety nets was absolute. The untouchable matriarch was suddenly standing in the middle of her opulent corner office, holding an empty scotch glass, while federal agents systematically boxed up her entire 40-year legacy. While Victoria watched her empire crumble under federal authority, her son was desperately attempting his own disastrous escape. Julian had woken up in his luxury condominium completely terrified. The news of the federal raid on the corporate headquarters had spread across the local news channels before breakfast. He knew his mother was going down, and he knew the authorities would inevitably come searching for the spineless heir who had actively facilitated the corruption. Julian hurriedly packed a single designer leather suitcase. He abandoned his expensive vehicle in the parking garage and ordered a private car service to transport him directly to the Bismarck Municipal Airport. His frantic plan was to board a domestic connection to an international hub and immediately flee to a nation lacking a standardized extradition treaty. He was sweating profusely, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as he walked through the sliding glass doors of the departure terminal. He approached the security checkpoint, trying to project an air of calm, wealthy entitlement. He handed his platinum passport and his first-class boarding pass to the uniformed transportation security agent. The agent swiped the passport through the digital scanner. The small screen did not flash the standard green approval light. It illuminated in a bright, alarming shade of red. The agent frowned, staring at the specific code populating the monitor. The agent quietly picked up a designated landline telephone and spoke exactly 3 words. Julian felt the blood drain entirely from his face. He reached forward, attempting to snatch his passport back from the counter. 2 armed airport police officers materialized silently behind him. They placed their heavy hands firmly on his trembling shoulders. When the federal government executes a massive criminal asset seizure related to international wire fraud, the automated system immediately casts a wide, inescapable net. The algorithms automatically flag the social security numbers and travel documents of every primary corporate officer associated with the seized accounts. Julian was officially classified as a severe flight risk tied to an active federal embezzlement probe. He was not going to a tropical paradise. He was going to a sterile, windowless detention room in the back of the airport. Sitting in my warm cabin, I received the breaking news alerts on my encrypted monitor. I watched the local broadcasters describe the shocking federal raid and the sudden suspension of the real estate conglomerate. I gently rocked my infant daughter, feeling the soft rhythm of her breathing against my chest. Every single trap they fell into was constructed using their own blinding greed. They could not resist trying to control the money, and that uncontrollable urge had completely annihilated them. The sheer scale of the devastation was almost difficult to comprehend, even for the architect of the collapse. Victoria had spent her entire adult life believing that money was the ultimate, absolute shield against consequence. She had used her phenomenal wealth to crush small business owners, intimidate local politicians, and bully vulnerable family members into complete submission. She had cultivated an aura of terrifying invincibility. But that invincibility was entirely reliant on continuous, uninterrupted access to liquid capital. Without the ability to wire funds, cut checks, or access her staggering lines of credit, Victoria was immediately reduced to the status of an ordinary, vulnerable citizen. The prestigious law firm that had proudly represented her corporate interests for 2 decades sent a very brief, highly sanitized courier message to her private residence later that afternoon. The senior partners formally informed her that, due to the federal asset seizure and the subsequent inability to secure their exorbitant legal retainers, they were officially withdrawing their representation across all civil and criminal matters. She was completely abandoned. The sycophantic executives who used to praise her ruthless business acumen were currently busy offering sworn testimonies to the federal prosecutors, hoping to secure their own immunity deals. The wealthy socialites who regularly attended her lavish charity galas stopped answering her frantic telephone calls. The terrifying matriarch was suddenly isolated, trapped inside a sprawling mansion she could no longer legally sell or borrow against. I opened my encrypted laptop and reviewed the comprehensive digital timeline of the last 5 days. From the moment they ambushed me in the Stark recovery room to the precise second Julian was detained at the airport security checkpoint, the sequence of events had unfolded with terrifying mathematical perfection. I did not possess millions of dollars in my personal checking account. I did not have a sprawling network of intimidating corporate lawyers. I only possessed a deep, intimate understanding of how structural compliance operates. I understood that if you gently push a profoundly arrogant person toward a highly regulated boundary, they will invariably attempt to smash right through it. Victoria thought she was forcefully breaking my spirit. In reality, she was aggressively shattering her own meticulously constructed glass house. The stage was now perfectly set for my official emergence from the shadows. I had patiently waited for the federal authorities to neutralize their financial weapons and dismantle their defensive barriers. Now that my husband and my mother-in-law were entirely stripped of their power and their prestige, it was finally time for me to introduce the ultimate legal reckoning. The avalanche of subpoenas was quietly waiting to be released, and it would permanently sever my children from their toxic bloodline. The American justice system is a sprawling, formidable machine, powered almost exclusively by liquid capital. When the federal authorities froze those corporate accounts and seized the personal portfolios, they did not merely confiscate money. They systematically stripped away the impenetrable armor that had protected my mother-in-law for 4 decades. Wealthy individuals rarely experience the actual inside of a courtroom because their expensive retainers keep the ugly realities of the law at a comfortable distance. But without access to her immense fortune, Victoria Sterling was violently thrust into the terrifying reality faced by ordinary, vulnerable citizens. The elite prestige law firm that had guarded her empire sent a sterile, impersonal courier message, formally withdrawing their representation. The withdrawal left Victoria staggering. She suddenly needed immediate, aggressive legal defense for the impending preliminary civil hearings, but she possessed zero ability to pay for it. The untouchable real estate magnate was forced to rely on a frantic, overworked civil advocate assigned to handle emergency dockets. This was a bargain-tier attorney whose office was located next to a strip mall laundromat, a man who smelled of stale coffee and carried a battered briefcase overflowing with disorganized files. He did not care about her legacy. He only cared about surviving his overwhelming daily caseload. While Victoria was desperately trying to explain her vast, complicated corporate architecture to a discount lawyer, I finally emerged from the shadows. I had waited patiently in the freezing wilderness until their defensive walls were pulverized into dust. Now it was time to launch the ground assault. I retained a brilliant, quiet family law attorney based in Bismarck. I did not hire him to argue. I hired him to deliver a specialized payload. Through my attorney, I filed a colossal, comprehensive civil lawsuit. The legal claims were devastating and absolute. I sued Victoria and Julian for severe, intentional infliction of emotional distress, extreme criminal coercion, and malicious conspiracy. Furthermore, I demanded full, unassailable physical and legal custody of my newborn twins, requiring permanent restraining orders against every single member of the Sterling bloodline. A standard civil petition is usually a brief document outlining basic grievances, but my filing was a weaponized encyclopedia. The pebble that fundamentally destroyed any chance of a cohesive defense was the staggering mountain of documentation I attached directly to the lawsuit. It was a massive physical binder weighing nearly 10 pounds, containing the irrefutable chronological autopsy of their corruption. Exhibit A was the crystal-clear audio file of Julian sobbing on my sister Evelyn concrete porch, voluntarily confessing that the hospital ambush was a premeditated, malicious trap. Exhibit B was the meticulous forensic breakdown of the forged retroactive surrogacy contract, complete with the digital pixel overlay, and the sworn signed admission from Gregory, the terrified corporate notary. Exhibit C contained the unredacted Financial Crimes Enforcement Network alerts, proving Victoria committed federal wire fraud when she attempted to unilaterally claw back the trust funds. Exhibit D was the explosive collection of extortion text messages Blair had surrendered to the state attorney office, outlining the exact conspiracy to steal my infants. The sheer volume of undeniable truth was suffocating. I did not leave a single shadow for them to hide inside. The physical delivery of this massive legal payload was orchestrated with precise theatrical timing. Victoria was sitting alone inside her skeletal corporate office. The federal agents had previously confiscated her dual-monitor computer terminals, her filing cabinets, and her secure communications servers. She sat behind a massive, empty mahogany desk, staring blankly at the beige carpet. A process server wearing a heavy winter jacket walked past the vacant reception desk. He entered the executive suite without knocking. He did not say a word. He simply dropped the massive 10-pound legal binder directly onto the center of her desk. The heavy thud echoed sharply off the floor-to-ceiling windows. He handed her a single sheet of paper, confirming she had been formally served, and then turned around and walked away. I received the delivery confirmation on my encrypted laptop just minutes later. I could visualize her opening that thick binder. I could imagine the exact moment her eyes scanned the table of contents, realizing that every single toxic secret she thought she had successfully buried was now permanent, public record. The immediate introduction of this lawsuit ignited a spectacular minor conflict that fractured the remaining family dynamic into a million jagged pieces. There is no honor among thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty among arrogant cowards facing massive prison sentences. Julian received his copy of the lawsuit while sitting inside a modest rented apartment, having been released on restrictive bail following his disastrous airport detention. He read through the devastating exhibits and realized his own recorded confession was the primary weapon I was using to secure full custody. The overwhelming panic severed his final remaining tie to his mother. Desperate to salvage any microscopic scrap of his frozen trust fund, Julian officially turned on Victoria. He hired his own discount defense attorney and filed a grotesque, self-serving affidavit with the family court. In his sworn legal response, my husband painted himself as a battered, helpless victim of profound psychological abuse. He aggressively claimed that Victoria was a tyrannical monster who micromanaged his entire existence. He legally stated that the hospital ambush was entirely her sinister invention, and that she had violently threatened to cut off his inheritance if he refused to comply with her demands. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the matriarch, attempting to shift the entire burden of the criminal coercion onto her shoulders. The family unit that had stood united in my sterile hospital recovery room just weeks prior united in their vicious desire to destroy my life, had spectacularly shattered. They were no longer a cohesive dynasty. They were starving wolves trapped inside a deep, concrete pit, viciously tearing at each other's throats to survive. I sat by the roaring fire in my isolated cabin, reading the continuous updates forwarded by my attorney. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering sorrow for the marriage that had evaporated. I experienced a cold, analytical satisfaction. The mathematics of my strategy were balancing perfectly. I had engineered a flawless, pressurized environment, ensuring that their own inherent selfishness would do all the heavy lifting. I watched the snow fall outside my reinforced windows, holding a warm mug of tea. The twins were asleep in their nursery, safe and entirely removed from the radioactive fallout of their father bloodline. I had successfully transformed from a disposable incubator into an untouchable architect of justice. But the legal maneuvering was merely the prelude to the final mandatory confrontation. The judge assigned to untangle the monumental mess of the $22 million trust and the contested custody battle recognized the extreme volatility of the situation. To prevent the upcoming criminal trials from bleeding into the delicate family court proceedings, the magistrate issued a strict, non-negotiable order. Before the prosecutors could begin presenting their felony indictments to a grand jury, all involved parties were legally compelled to attend a mandatory emergency arbitration hearing. We were all going to be forced into a single room. I would no longer be a ghost hiding in the northern wilderness. I was about to look the people who tried to buy my children directly in the eye and deliver the final, devastating blow that would permanently erase them from our lives. The federal justice system moves with a slow, deliberate momentum. But the family court system prioritizes immediate stability, especially when infants are involved. The presiding judge assigned to untangle our colossal legal nightmare recognized a severe procedural hazard. If the federal prosecutors moved forward with their sweeping criminal indictments before the custody and financial disputes were fully resolved, the entire situation would devolve into a chaotic, decade-long jurisdictional nightmare. To prevent this, the magistrate mandated an emergency binding arbitration session. It was an absolute requirement. We had to establish permanent custody and officially settle the $22 million trust allocation before the criminal trials commenced. This was the monumental confrontation I had meticulously prepared for since the night I left the hospital. The arbitration was scheduled to take place inside a stark, sterile, glass-walled conference room located in a neutral municipal building in downtown Fargo. I absolutely refused to attend the proceedings in person. My physical safety and my psychological boundaries were non-negotiable. Instead, I appeared via a highly secure, encrypted, high-definition video link, broadcasting directly from my isolated wilderness sanctuary. This setup provided me with an overwhelming psychological advantage. I held absolute, total control over my environment. I could adjust the volume, I could frame my camera angle, and I could observe them without ever sharing the same physical air. When the encrypted video feed connected, the monitor on my rustic dining table flickered to life. The visual feed offered a devastating portrait of complete systemic collapse. Victoria Sterling sat on the far left side of the long, artificial wood conference table. The terrifying real estate magnate who used to command corporate boardrooms with a single, icy glare had aged a full decade in a matter of weeks. The stress of the federal asset seizures, the humiliating margin calls, and the impending felony indictments had completely drained the terrifying vitality from her bones. She wore a dark designer suit, but it hung loosely off her shrinking frame, looking less like protective armor and more like a borrowed, oversized coat. She kept her hands clasped tightly on the table, knuckles turning a stark shade of white. She spent her entire existence cultivating an aura of absolute physical intimidation. But without her staggering bank accounts fueling that illusion, she was just a brittle, exhausted woman facing total ruin. Julian sat at the opposite end of the table, deliberately putting as much physical distance between himself and his mother as the room allowed. My cowardly husband possessed a background built entirely on superficial charm and expensive grooming. He had always relied on a bright smile and a platinum credit card to navigate through life. Both of those tools were currently utterly useless. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumped forward. He absolutely refused to look up at the large television monitor displaying my face. He stared intensely at a blank yellow legal pad resting in front of him, completely terrified of meeting my gaze. Seated perfectly between them was their newly appointed legal counsel. Because their elite, prestigious law firm had completely abandoned them upon the federal freezing of their assets, they were forced to rely on a discount civil mediator. This attorney was a tired, frantic-looking man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He nervously shuffled a disorganized stack of printed emails and court filings, clearly overwhelmed by the phenomenal complexity of the federal wire fraud and the overlapping custody demands. The designated judicial arbitrator, a stern, pragmatic woman with silver hair, initiated the session. She instructed the discount attorney to present an opening statement on behalf of the Sterling family. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his crooked tie. He launched into a pathetic, highly scripted monologue attempting to appeal to my sense of morality. He used phrases like family preservation and restorative healing. He softly suggested that despite the unfortunate misunderstandings of the past few weeks, children inherently need a relationship with their paternal relatives. He actually possessed the sheer audacity to propose a shared custody arrangement accompanied by a mutual dissolution of the irrevocable trust so Victoria could satisfy her aggressive commercial lenders. I did not yell at the monitor. I did not cry tears of righteous indignation. Anger is an incredibly useless emotion during a financial negotiation. I simply waited for the overwhelmed lawyer to finish his ridiculous, sentimental speech. When the conference room finally fell completely silent, I looked directly into the camera lens. I politely asked the arbitrator for permission to share my screen. The judge granted my request. With a single click of my computer mouse, the large television monitor inside the Fargo conference room switched from my face to a highly detailed, incredibly dense commercial financial spreadsheet. I began my presentation with the cold, clinical precision of a senior commercial escrow auditor delivering a quarterly mortality report. I did not address their emotional pleas. I addressed the fundamental mathematics of their existence. I highlighted the specific column detailing Victoria's overarching corporate holding structure. I meticulously walked the arbitrator through the exact sequence of the catastrophic financial events. I displayed the automated banking notices proving the $15 million margin call. I showed the federal seizure documents locking down her liquid capital. I presented the Securities and Exchange Commission mandate completely halting all public trading of her commercial assets. I factored in the extreme punitive banking penalties accumulating daily due to her defaulted commercial mortgages. Then I displayed the final mathematical calculation at the bottom of the spreadsheet. I coldly explained to the room that Victoria Sterling was no longer a millionaire. Because she had aggressively guaranteed the $22 million trust with her corporate collateral, and because that collateral had spectacularly imploded her personal net worth, was now mathematically negative. She owed the banking institution significantly more money than she could ever possibly generate. I proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that placing my children anywhere near this phenomenal financial black hole would constitute extreme, severe negligence. Following the financial audit, I seamlessly transitioned to the criminal liability presentation. I pulled up the high-resolution images of the forged retroactive surrogacy contract. I displayed the pixel-perfect digital overlay proving the signature was a crude electronic lift stolen directly from my old prenuptial agreement. I showed the automated alerts generated by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, explicitly documenting Victoria's malicious attempt to commit federal wire fraud. The overwhelming weight of the undeniable truth suffocated the conference room. Victoria closed her eyes, her jaw trembling slightly. The discount lawyer stopped shuffling his papers, realizing his clients had fundamentally lied to him about the severity of their actions. This relentless presentation ignited a sudden, pathetic, minor confrontation. Julian completely broke under the immense psychological pressure of seeing his crimes laid out in stark digital reality. He suddenly leaned forward, grabbing the microphone positioned in the center of the artificial wood table. He looked up at the screen, his eyes wide and brimming with desperate, panicked tears. "Gladys, please," he begged, his voice cracking loudly over the audio feed. "I am so deeply sorry. I never wanted any of this to happen. My mother forced me to do it. Blair threatened to ruin me. I was just so scared. I love you. We can fix this if you just drop the lawsuit. Please, just let me be a father." Julian was attempting to use the exact same manipulative tactic he had utilized his entire life, playing the helpless victim, demanding unearned absolution. He expected me to engage in a tearful, dramatic argument. He wanted a reaction to validate his existence. I did not argue with a coward. I simply moved my computer mouse, hovering the cursor over the audio control panel on my screen. I clicked the small microphone icon located next to his name. I muted him. The sudden, absolute silence that filled the video feed was profound. Julian continued moving his mouth frantically, speaking into a dead microphone completely stripped of his voice and his power. It was the ultimate demonstration of total, absolute control. I turned my attention back to the judicial arbitrator. I delivered my final, non-negotiable terms in a perfectly steady, unwavering tone. I demanded full, exclusive, physical, and legal custody of my children immediately. I demanded permanent, lifetime restraining orders against Julian, Victoria, and Blair, explicitly preventing them from ever approaching my physical location. Finally, I demanded the formal, permanent release of any remaining legal claim to the $22 million trust, ensuring the capital remained exclusively controlled by an independent fiduciary acting solely on behalf of the twins. The arbitrator looked at the devastating forensic evidence displayed on the screen and then looked at the two shattered criminals sitting silently in the room. The decision was incredibly obvious. But what Victoria failed to realize in that moment was the devastating secondary consequence of my legal victory. The court was about to officially enforce the terms of the trust she had guaranteed. And to satisfy that colossal financial mandate, the legal system was going to forcefully, violently liquidate every single personal asset she had left, sending a brand new, catastrophic shockwave directly through her crumbling life. The judicial arbitrator sat in absolute silence for several long, agonizing minutes. The heavy quiet inside the Fargo conference room was thick enough to suffocate a person. The silver-haired magistrate carefully reviewed the final pages of my colossal forensic binder. She possessed decades of experience navigating bitter, contentious family disputes. She was entirely accustomed to angry parents fighting over holiday schedules and modest savings accounts. She was not accustomed to witnessing a billionaire matriarch meticulously orchestrate a fraudulent conspiracy to purchase newborn infants using highly leveraged commercial real estate debt. When the judge finally looked up from the terrifying mountain of undeniable evidence, her expression was completely devoid of sympathy. She did not ask Victoria or Julian for any further clarifications. The truth was glaringly obvious. The legal standard in family court is fundamentally based upon the best interests of the children. Exposing two vulnerable infants to an environment plagued by severe criminal coercion, active federal investigations, and staggering financial insolvency constituted profound negligence. The magistrate delivered her ruling with the swift, brutal efficiency of a falling axe. She immediately granted my petition in its entirety. I was awarded full, unassailable legal and physical custody of my son and daughter. She approved the permanent lifetime restraining orders, completely barring Julian, Victoria, and Blair from ever contacting us or approaching our physical location. That specific decree permanently severed my children from the toxic Sterling bloodline. But the custody ruling was only the first half of the monumental arbitration. The climax of my strategic war hinged entirely upon the financial arithmetic surrounding the $22 million trust. The discount defense attorney attempted one final pathetic maneuver. He politely asked the judge to dissolve the irrevocable trust, arguing that because the initial transaction was highly contested, the capital should be returned to the corporate holding company to satisfy the furious commercial lenders. He claimed Victoria was facing an unfair, catastrophic hardship. The arbitrator denied his request instantly. She cited the exact, strict, non-revocation clause Victoria had so arrogantly forced me to sign in the hospital recovery room. The matriarch had demanded an airtight contract, ensuring I could never return the hush money. The judge legally validated that specific clause, permanently cementing the capital within the boundaries of the generation-skipping trust. But here is where the true, breathtaking beauty of commercial financial accountability arrived. Here is where the phenomenal weight of Victoria-owned malicious actions finally crushed her into dust. When I initially executed the transfer, I specifically named Victoria Primary Corporate Holding Entity as the permanent financial guarantor of the trust. Under normal economic circumstances, a thriving real estate empire could easily back a $22 million obligation. However, these were not normal circumstances. Because Victoria had foolishly attempted to recall the funds using an illegal executive override, she triggered the massive Securities and Exchange Commission investigation. That federal probe resulted in an immediate halt on all public trading associated with her company. Furthermore, her commercial lenders were actively calling in their defaulted mortgages. The current market value of her corporate shares had violently plummeted. The holding company was essentially worthless. Therefore, the trust established for my children was legally classified as severely underfunded. To rectify this massive discrepancy, the arbitrator applied a devastating legal doctrine known as piercing the corporate veil. When a corporate guarantor commits explicit, documented fraud, the legal system is allowed to bypass the protective shell of the business entity and aggressively target the personal wealth of the responsible individual. The judge looked directly at Victoria and delivered the lethal financial blow. She legally ordered the immediate, aggressive liquidation of every single remaining personal asset belonging to the matriarch to fulfill the binding mandate of the trust. The scope of this judicial order was absolute and terrifying. The sprawling primary estate in the most affluent subdivision of Bismarck would be seized and auctioned. Her fleet of imported luxury vehicles would be repossessed. Her private offshore retirement accounts, which had previously managed to evade the initial federal freeze, were now officially subpoenaed and drained. Her exclusive private art collection, her expensive jewelry, her designer furniture, everything was legally marked for immediate liquidation. Every single penny generated from these sales would be directly funneled into the irrevocable trust, securely managed by an independent fiduciary acting solely for the benefit of my twins. The mathematics of the ruling were perfectly balanced. The legal system was forcefully dragging Victoria Sterling's personal net worth down to an absolute, unrecoverable zero. The psychological dam holding Victoria together completely shattered. The exhausted, brittle woman sitting in the conference room violently snapped. She jumped up from the artificial wood table, pushing her chair backwards so forcefully it crashed loudly onto the carpeted floor. She lost every microscopic ounce of her carefully cultivated aristocratic composure. She lunged toward the television monitor, screaming at the top of her lungs. Her face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at the camera lens. She accused me of being a malicious, calculating thief. She shrieked that I had purposefully orchestrated her complete, systemic ruin, deliberately trapping her in a web of deceit. She wailed that she had spent 40 grueling years building a regional monopoly, only to have a disposable daughter-in-law steal her entire magnificent legacy. I sat in my warm, comfortable cabin, completely unaffected by her chaotic, violent tantrum. I watched her rave and thrash like a trapped animal. I waited for her to pause for a single breath. I calmly moved my computer mouse across the desk. I hovered the cursor over the audio control panel displayed on my secure video feed. I clicked the small microphone icon, unmuting my audio line for the first time during the entire arbitration. My voice resonated through the speakers inside the Fargo conference room, perfectly steady, cold, and absolute. You named the price for my children, Victoria. I just made sure the check cleared. I immediately clicked the icon again, plunging my end of the feed back into total silence. The impact of those 2 sentences was physically visible. Victoria stopped screaming. Her mouth hung slightly open. The horrible, undeniable truth of her situation washed over her. She had arrogantly set the trap, she had determined the exorbitant ransom, and she had aggressively forced the transaction. I merely possessed the intelligence to follow her instructions to their ultimate, devastating conclusion. She slowly sank back down into her chair, burying her face in her hands. A woman who possessed absolutely nothing left to lose. As the arbitration concluded, the minor conflict involving Blair also reached its pathetic, inevitable resolution. While the matriarch was losing her entire fortune, the ambitious mistress was desperately attempting to navigate her own legal nightmare. Blair had proudly handed her smartphone over to the state attorney office, securing whistleblower immunity regarding the financial embezzlement. She mistakenly believed this immunity granted her total, absolute protection. She was profoundly incorrect. Immunity for reporting corporate fraud does not magically erase the fact that she committed severe federal perjury in a separate family court jurisdiction. The magistrate who threw out her fabricated kidnapping affidavit had already forwarded the paperwork to the criminal prosecutors. Blair was officially facing a severe felony perjury charge. Normally, a woman in her position would turn to her wealthy older lover for a massive legal bailout. She desperately needed an elite defense attorney to keep her out of a concrete cell. She called Julian frantic and demanding. But Julian was completely broke. His trust fund was frozen, his mother was destitute, and his future was entirely beholden to a public defender. He had absolutely zero capital to offer her. Blair was completely abandoned. The wealthy, powerful family she thought was her golden ticket to a life of opulent luxury had entirely disintegrated. She was left standing completely alone, facing a terrifying felony indictment, without a single dollar to her name. The parasite had successfully killed the host organism, but now the parasite was going to starve to death in the cold. The financial war was officially over. I had successfully balanced their corrupt ledgers to absolute zero. The civil boundaries were drawn, and the custody of my children was permanently secured. But the end of the arbitration merely signaled the beginning of an entirely different kind of destruction. The civil judge had untangled the money, but the federal agents and the district attorneys were standing right outside the door, waiting for the gavel to fall. The loss of wealth is a devastating psychological blow, but the impending loss of physical freedom is a nightmare that requires handcuffs. The criminal reckonings were finally ready to commence. The civil justice system is designed to strip away your wealth, but the criminal justice system is designed to strip away your physical autonomy. Losing a sprawling real estate empire is a devastating psychological blow, but it happens inside comfortable, carpeted courtrooms and sleek corporate offices. The transition from civil accountability to federal criminal prosecution changes the fundamental atmosphere of the conflict. The air becomes incredibly rigid. The men who arrive to enforce the consequences do not wear expensive tailored suits or carry designer briefcases. They wear dark, heavy tactical gear, and they carry specialized extraction equipment. My meticulous financial audit had essentially done all the grueling investigative heavy lifting for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had gift-wrapped a monumental white-collar conspiracy, providing the exact routing numbers, the time-stamped digital footprints, the sworn confessions, and the pixel-perfect forgery analysis. The federal prosecutors did not need to spend months meticulously building a circumstantial case. They simply took my comprehensive blueprint, submitted the overwhelming evidence to a grand jury, and immediately secured the felony arrest warrants. The terrifying reality of Victoria Sterling's rapid descent from untouchable billionaire to common criminal was visually captured during the execution of those warrants. Because the family court arbitrator had legally mandated the immediate, aggressive liquidation of her entire personal portfolio to satisfy the $22 million trust deficit, Victoria had been forcefully evicted from her sprawling, majestic estate. The banks seized the massive property, preparing it for a high-profile commercial auction. The matriarch was suddenly rendered completely homeless. Without access to her frozen bank accounts, she was forced to rent a cramped, depressing, short-term corporate apartment located on the dreary industrial outskirts of Bismarck. It was a bleak, unimaginative space filled with cheap synthetic furniture and smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke from previous, desperate tenants. This dismal environment was exactly where the federal authorities finally cornered her. Just before dawn on a frigid Tuesday morning, a convoy of unmarked government vehicles quietly surrounded the decaying apartment complex. Armed federal agents moved swiftly up the exterior concrete stairwell. They did not gently tap on the cheap hollow core door. They pounded their heavy fists against the frame, announcing their presence with deafening, absolute authority. Victoria opened the door wearing a faded silk robe, her hair unkempt and her face completely devoid of makeup. The towering federal agents flooded into the tiny synthetic living room. They read her the Miranda rights in a flat, practiced monotone. They formally charged the former real estate titan with a staggering list of severe felonies, including aggressive federal wire fraud, malicious conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminal forgery. The visual contrast was absolutely breathtaking. Just a few short weeks prior, this exact same woman had confidently marched into my sterile hospital recovery room, smelling of expensive imported perfume, carelessly dropping a massive cashier check onto my tray table. She had looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated supremacy, genuinely believing she could casually purchase human beings like commercial properties. Now that profound arrogance had completely evaporated. The federal agents firmly instructed her to place her hands behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her previously manicured wrists echoed loudly through the miserable little apartment. She was led out into the freezing morning air, forced to duck her head as they guided her into the cramped, rigid back seat of a federal cruiser. But the true, majestic irony of her criminal downfall, the perfectly polished pebble that permanently sealed her miserable fate, occurred later that afternoon during her initial arraignment hearing. Victoria stood before a stern federal magistrate inside the towering downtown courthouse. She wore a bright orange, high-visibility jumpsuit, an outfit that completely stripped away her carefully cultivated aristocratic identity. Her discount public defender frantically petitioned the court to grant pretrial release. He passionately argued that Victoria was a prominent local businesswoman with deep established roots in the North Dakota community, insisting she posed absolutely zero flight risk. He practically begged the judge to set a reasonable bail amount so she could prepare her defense from the comfort of a private residence. The lead federal prosecutor calmly stood up and approached the podium. He carried a single thin file folder containing the digital network logs I had previously surrendered to the authorities. The prosecutor explicitly reminded the magistrate that during Victoria's desperate manic attempt to locate my secure wilderness cabin, she had authorized her corporate intelligence team to execute an aggressive cyber intrusion. She had purposefully instructed her hackers to breach the artificial Delaware shell company I created to serve as a decoy. To facilitate that illegal hack, her team had utilized a sophisticated web of anonymous offshore routing servers and untraceable international proxy networks attempting to mask their digital signatures. The prosecutor looked directly at the judge and delivered the lethal argument. He stated that because the defendant possessed demonstrated, verified access to anonymous offshore digital infrastructure and clearly harbored a malicious intent to bypass federal monitoring systems, she must be legally classified as an extreme international flight risk. Victoria stared in absolute horror as her own illicit espionage tactics were weaponized against her. The meticulous digital breadcrumb trail I engineered, the fake relocation payment that triggered her hacking attempt, had blossomed into her ultimate cage. The magistrate agreed entirely with the prosecution. He struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, denying bail completely. Victoria was immediately remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals Service. She was dragged out of the bright courtroom and transported directly to a bleak concrete federal holding facility, forced to await her impending trial, locked inside a windowless cell. While the matriarch was experiencing the brutal reality of maximum security incarceration, her cowardly son was rapidly accelerating his own disgraceful capitulation. Julian was formally indicted as a crucial accessory to the massive wire fraud conspiracy. Federal agents apprehended him outside a cheap local diner, placing him in handcuffs while confused patrons watched through the greasy glass windows. Julian possessed a psychological framework built entirely out of spun sugar and false bravado. He had never faced a genuine consequence in his entire pampered life. The absolute terror of facing a hardened federal interrogator broke him instantly. He did not endure hours of intense, grueling questioning. He did not defiantly demand the presence of a high-powered defense attorney. The moment the investigators placed him inside a sterile, chilled interrogation room and presented the staggering evidence, Julian completely folded. He immediately begged for a cooperation agreement. To save his own miserable skin, Julian agreed to turn state evidence against his own mother. He signed a comprehensive plea deal, formally admitting his active role in the hospital ambush and the subsequent embezzlement cover-up. He promised to testify truthfully and extensively against Victoria during her upcoming criminal trial, providing the prosecution with every single damning detail of her corrupt reign. In exchange for this profound, ultimate betrayal, the prosecutors agreed to recommend a drastically reduced sentence for the spineless heir. The mathematics of their respective punishments were finalized shortly after. Julian cowardice earned him a relatively brief 36-month sentence to be served at a minimum security federal prison camp, a facility frequently reserved for compliant white-collar criminals. Victoria, on the other hand, refused to accept a plea. Her toxic, blinding pride forced her to take the case to trial, where she was spectacularly, completely decimated by her own son's sworn testimony. She received a crushing 15-year mandatory sentence inside a rigid, unforgiving federal penitentiary, effectively ensuring the aging matriarch would spend the vast remainder of her natural life behind thick iron bars. With the primary architects of the corruption securely locked inside federal cages, the commercial real estate market moved swiftly to erase the lingering stain of their existence. The terrified board of directors overseeing the frozen corporate holding company held one final emergency summit. The executives were desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic radioactive fallout of the fraud convictions. They formally voted to completely dissolve the overarching corporate structure. The massive empire Victoria had spent 4 decades ruthlessly assembling was aggressively dismantled, sold off in fragmented pieces to rival commercial syndicates at significantly discounted rates. The most satisfying visual confirmation of this total structural erasure occurred a few weeks later. I watched a live local news broadcast showing a massive industrial crane parked outside the towering downtown Bismarck skyscraper that formerly served as their flagship headquarters. A team of workers utilizing heavy welding torches and thick steel cables systematically dismantled the massive, glowing letters spelling out the sterling name. One by one, the massive metallic characters were ripped away from the glass facade, lowered onto a flatbed truck, and hauled away to a scrapyard. The untouchable dynasty was entirely dead. The empire had been pulverized into dust. The wealth had been legally redistributed to my children, and the criminals were locked inside concrete boxes. The phenomenal, chaotic war was finally over, leaving nothing behind but the quiet, serene aftermath. Yet despite the total annihilation of his family legacy, Julian simply could not accept that his connection to me was permanently severed. As the dust settled across the frozen North Dakota landscape, my incarcerated husband was preparing to make one final, pathetic attempt to reach across the massive legal boundaries, hoping to extract a tiny sliver of unearned absolution. Exactly 6 months had passed since that suffocating night in the Bismarck Recovery Ward. The brutal North Dakota winter had finally surrendered to a crisp, bright spring. The thick ice blanketing the pine trees outside my secure cabin melted into rushing streams. The seasonal transition perfectly mirrored the definitive conclusion of the most grueling chapter of my existence. The United States Postal Service delivered a thick, reinforced envelope from my family law attorney. The parcel contained the final certified divorce decree. The marriage that began under the terrifying shadow of a draconian prenuptial agreement was officially dissolved. I sat at my rustic oak dining table, running my fingers across the heavy legal parchment. The document bore the raised seal of the county court, validating the permanent dissolution. I turned to the final page to examine the signature block. My ex-husband had signed his name on the designated line. However, the notary stamp positioned directly beneath his messy cursive did not belong to a corrupt corporate lackey desperately trying to please a billionaire matriarch. The stamp belonged to the official warden of a minimum security federal correctional institution located in South Dakota. The visual representation of his spectacular downfall was permanently inked onto the binding legal paperwork. As I shifted the thick stack of legal documents, a single loose piece of paper fluttered out from the middle of the packet and landed softly on the wooden table. It was a handwritten letter from Julian. The contrast between his former life and his current reality was violently apparent in the physical material. Julian used to draft casual notes on heavy imported cardstock embossed with the Sterling family crest. The page resting on my table was a sheet of cheap, flimsy-lined commissary paper. The blue ink was smeared in several places, indicating the rushing, panicked motion of the hand holding the ballpoint pen. He had bypassed the formal legal channels and slipped the personal note into the manila envelope, hoping the attorney would simply forward the entire package without inspecting the contents. I picked up the thin paper, feeling its rough, cheap texture against my fingertips. I read the frantic, scrawled paragraphs. Julian began the letter by detailing his miserable daily routine inside the federal prison camp. He complained bitterly about the terrible synthetic food, the exhausting manual labor assignments, and the profound isolation. He whined about the complete lack of respect he received from the prison guards and the other incarcerated inmates. His tone was drenched in his typical, pathetic self-pity. He desperately wanted me to know how much he was suffering, genuinely believing I would somehow find his discomfort tragic rather than entirely justified. Then he pivoted to his primary objective. He begged me for a single photograph of the newborn twins. He promised he was attending mandatory counseling sessions. He swore he was a fundamentally changed man attempting to rebuild his morality from the ground up. He pleaded for a tiny, microscopic sliver of grace, arguing that staring at a picture of his son and daughter would give him the necessary strength to survive his 36-month sentence. He asked me to look deep into my heart and find the basic human decency to grant a broken father one simple request. As I read the final, desperate sentence, a strange, unexpected sensation bloomed in the center of my chest. It was the final, minor internal conflict of the entire war. A microscopic wave of genuine pity washed over me. It was a biological, maternal instinct recognizing the profound tragedy of the situation. Julian was technically the biological father of the two beautiful infants currently sleeping peacefully in the adjacent nursery. A tiny fragment of my soul mourned for the father those children deserved but would never receive. I felt a brief, fleeting sadness for a man who possessed every single advantage the world had to offer, yet foolishly traded a beautiful, loving family for the hollow promises of a parasitic mistress and the conditional approval of a tyrannical mother. The emotional pebble was real, but it was incredibly brief. The seasoned commercial escrow auditor residing inside my brain instantly crushed the flare of sentimental vulnerability. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath. I actively summoned the precise memory of the hospital ambush. I recalled the overpowering, suffocating scent of the heavy vanilla perfume radiating from Blair as she stood in my recovery room wearing my stolen diamond tennis bracelet. I remembered the sharp, arrogant slap of the manila folder hitting my plastic tray table. I visualized the $22 million cashier check demanding my absolute erasure. Pity is a highly dangerous structural vulnerability. In the realm of risk assessment and secure auditing, every single unnecessary interaction represents a potential security breach. Sending a printed photograph to a federal inmate is not a gesture of harmless grace. It is handing the enemy a tangible thread of connection. And a desperate man with years of idle time will incessantly pull on any available thread until the entire fabric unravels. Answering his plea would validate his manipulative tactics and explicitly teach him that my ironclad boundaries possessed hidden weaknesses. I opened my eyes. I folded the cheap lined paper exactly along its original clumsy creases. I stood up from the dining table and walked across the room toward a heavy, fireproof steel lockbox concealed inside a discreet lower cabinet. I placed the begging letter inside the dark compartment, shut the heavy lid, and forcefully spun the combination dial, locking the document away forever. I did not draft a polite refusal. I did not contact my attorney to complain about the unauthorized correspondence. I understood that the most devastating, undeniable answer I could possibly provide was a permanent, deafening silence. The legal barrier separating my family from the Sterling bloodline remained unyielding and pristine. The lifetime protective restraining orders were fully active, registered across multiple law enforcement databases, and strictly monitored by municipal authorities. The severance was categorical and absolute. Julian possessed zero legal rights, no supervised visitation privileges, and absolutely no parental authority. To the legal system and to my children, he was officially classified as a ghost. The financial fortress I engineered was equally impenetrable. The $22 million sat securely behind an intricate labyrinth of diversified mutual funds, highly regulated federal bonds, and heavily guarded municipal securities. An independent fiduciary firm based in an entirely different state managed every single cent, acting exclusively on the strict legal behalf of my son and daughter. Victoria, rotting inside a maximum security penitentiary, Julian sweeping floors at a prison camp, and Blair fighting a desperate criminal defense would never possess the required legal standing to access even a fraction of a single penny. Thinking of Blair brought a cold, final sense of symmetry to the narrative. The ambitious young mistress who had stormed into the corporate corner office demanding a $5 million untraceable severance package was currently navigating the grim, unforgiving reality of the public defender system. She was actively standing trial for felony perjury, completely abandoned by the affluent dynasty she had so desperately tried to infiltrate. She had foolishly gambled her entire future on a stolen piece of jewelry and a hollow, arrogant promise. The pawn had attempted to blackmail the queen, only to find herself facing a terrifying prison sentence entirely alone. I walked over to the reinforced window and looked out at the vibrant green pines surrounding my sanctuary. The overarching methodology of my victory brought a profound sense of analytical satisfaction. The defining characteristic of the entire conflict was the pristine cleanliness of my strategy. I never hired shady private investigators to break into their downtown condominiums. I never forged a single legal signature. I never screamed profanities in crowded corporate lobbies or hurled expensive personal property into snowy alleyways. I never once lowered myself to their chaotic, erratic frequency. When profoundly entitled individuals are accustomed to steamrolling over ordinary vulnerable people, they invariably develop a massive terminal blind spot. They fundamentally believe their staggering wealth exempts them from the basic laws of physics, mathematics, and federal compliance. They believe they can rewrite reality simply by throwing enough money at the problem. I merely recognize that blinding terminal entitlement. I accurately identified the overwhelming, top-heavy nature of their corruption. I did not bring a violent wrecking ball to the Sterling commercial empire. I simply located the primary load-bearing pillars holding up their immense, fraudulent structure. I quietly stepped aside, removing myself and my children from the immediate impact zone. I allowed their inherent, unquenchable greed and their reckless, arrogant haste to naturally and violently collapse the entire building exactly where they were standing. They had enthusiastically crushed themselves beneath the phenomenal weight of their own breathtaking hubris. The fierce psychological adrenaline that had sustained my focus through the freezing winter and the brutal legal arbitrations began to slowly, permanently fade. The ledgers were balanced, the criminals were incarcerated, and the trust was invincible. The draining, exhausting war was definitively concluded, leaving behind a vast, quiet space. The stage was perfectly set for the final, tranquil chapter of our unburdened existence, preparing me to step forward into a future entirely defined by my own unshakable terms. The cyclical nature of the North Dakota seasons brings a specific type of profound comfort. Exactly 1 year has passed since the agonizing, sterile night in the Bismarck Recovery Ward. It is winter again. Outside the towering, reinforced windows of my living room, a fierce blizzard is actively burying the landscape under a thick, heavy blanket of brilliant white snow. The biting wind howls through the frozen branches of the surrounding pine forest, hammering against the exterior walls. But the brutal elements cannot breach the perimeter. Inside, the environment is immaculate, warm, and fiercely protected. I am sitting in a plush armchair bathed in the golden afternoon sunlight that streams through the triple-paned glass. The sprawling, comfortable home we currently occupy is not listed in any public county directory under the name Gladys Powell. The deed, the utility bills, and the property taxes are all securely registered under an anonymous, blind limited liability company managed by a secondary proxy firm located 3 states away. It is a modern, invisible fortress. On the thick, cream-colored wool rug stretching across the center of the room, my 1-year-old twins are happily navigating their domain. My son is diligently attempting to stack brightly colored wooden blocks, while my daughter crawls rapidly toward a stray toy, laughing a bright, resonant sound that fills the entire vaulted space. I watch them play, their small hands moving, with innocent, unburdened joy. They possess absolutely no memory of the terrifying hospital ambush, the frantic midnight escape, or the colossal legal war waged to secure their freedom. To them, the world has only ever been warm, safe, and infinitely loving. The suffocating chaos orchestrated by Victoria, Julian, and Blair feels like a bizarre cinematic tragedy from a previous lifetime. The terrifying monsters who tried to consume us are now safely locked away behind impenetrable walls of iron and concrete. I often think about the profound difference in our current environments. Victoria is waking up every single morning on a thin, rigid mattress inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The untouchable commercial real estate magnate, who previously mandated tailored designer suits and corner offices, now wears an identical abrasive khaki uniform. Her daily routine is strictly dictated by armed correctional officers. She spends her days navigating the grim, monotonous reality of a concrete cell entirely stripped of her phone, her influence, and her sprawling empire. Julian is enduring his own specific brand of institutional humiliation. He is currently navigating the rigid, unyielding hierarchy of a minimum security prison camp. The arrogant heir who historically solved every minor inconvenience by swiping a platinum credit card is now mopping cafeteria floors and cleaning industrial restrooms for pennies an hour. He is a forgotten ghost, haunting a facility designed to punish white-collar cowardice. Blair, the ambitious mistress who mistakenly believed a stolen diamond bracelet guaranteed a life of opulent luxury, is fundamentally ruined. Having been convicted of severe federal perjury, her youth and superficial charm proved entirely useless against the rigid sentencing guidelines. She is navigating the unforgiving restrictions of heavy probation, carrying a permanent felony record that effectively obliterates her ability to secure meaningful employment or infiltrate high society circles ever again. The parasitic fantasy she violently tried to steal dissolved into a lifelong nightmare. The physical and legal barriers separating my family from their toxic existence are absolute. I never look over my shoulder when I walk to my vehicle. I never flinch when my phone rings. The profound, unyielding silence they left behind is the most beautiful sound I have ever experienced. Despite the staggering fortune legally secured in my children's names, I did not retire to a life of idle luxury. I am back to work, operating on a flexible part-time schedule from my secure home office. I log into encrypted corporate networks, analyzing dense commercial ledgers and scrutinizing complex financial transactions. I continue to audit escrow accounts, hunting for the microscopic, hidden flaws buried deep inside other people's dense paperwork. Some people might question why a woman guarding a massive multi-million-dollar trust would bother reviewing spreadsheets for a standard salary. They fundamentally misunderstand the nature of my profession. Auditing is not merely a job, it is a highly specialized worldview. I continue to work because I genuinely love the pure, undeniable honesty of mathematics. I find profound satisfaction in uncovering the missing decimals, the forged dates, and the buried coercive clauses designed to exploit the vulnerable. I operate as a silent digital guardian, ensuring that greedy, arrogant individuals cannot successfully weaponize the fine print against unsuspecting victims. My work keeps my mind incredibly sharp and my defensive instincts perfectly honed. Furthermore, the colossal fortune surrendered by the Sterling dynasty does not belong to me. It belongs exclusively to the twins. The $22 million does not sit idle in a single vulnerable vault. The independent fiduciary firm I selected has meticulously allocated the capital across a diverse, highly secure financial architecture. The funds are shielded within conservative municipal bonds, stable index portfolios, and secure high-yield trust accounts. The money is quietly, reliably compounding in the dark. There is a breathtaking poetic justice woven into the fabric of that wealth. The initial cashier check was originally weaponized as a dirty, coercive bribe explicitly designed to purchase human beings and permanently erase a mother from existence. But through the grueling crucible of the federal justice system, that exact same capital was fundamentally purified. Untouched by the toxic, corrupt hands that originally offered it the money, was transformed into an unassailable financial shield. The liquidated remnants of Victoria's beloved commercial empire will eventually finance the elite university educations, the first homes, and the peaceful, secure lives of the very grandchildren she tried to steal. Her towering arrogance unwittingly guaranteed their permanent prosperity, while simultaneously guaranteeing her own total erasure. I set my ceramic mug of hot tea down on the wooden side table and looked directly toward the camera lens, addressing you, the audience, with a familiar, calm, and steady tone. I am not sharing the intimate details of this grueling warfare, so you will be impressed by the sheer magnitude of the numbers. The zeros printed on a bank statement are ultimately irrelevant to the fundamental lesson. I am telling you this specific story because somewhere out there, right now, someone is being aggressively bullied, intimidated, and marginalized by people who mistakenly believe that concentrated wealth equals undeniable power. We all encounter these toxic individuals. They exist in corporate boardrooms, they exist in neighborhood associations, and they exist at our family dinner tables. They utilize their financial leverage, their social status, or their overwhelming emotional volume to demand your absolute compliance. They deliberately engineer environments of rapid panic, expecting you to break under the immense pressure. They rely on your fear to maintain their unearned authority. Let them think wealth equals power. Let them construct their elaborate, intimidating traps. Let them confidently drop their threatening ultimatums directly onto your lap. You do not have to match their chaotic screaming. You do not have to sink into the mud and fight them on their unstable terms. You simply need to take a slow, deep breath, command your own nervous system, and carefully read the fine print. Find the structural flaw buried inside their blinding arrogance. Secure your unshakable boundaries. Utilize the cold, unforgiving logic of accountability, and then confidently walk away, allowing the immense, heavy structure of their own inherent corruption to collapse exactly where they are standing. You are incredibly capable of surviving the ambush, and you are entirely worthy of the quiet, unburdened peace that follows the storm. If you have ever stared down an entitled, toxic family member, protected your own peace, and successfully rebuilt your life on your own uncompromising terms, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share your own stories of escaping manipulative environments and discovering your profound strength. Your survival is a testament to quiet courage, and your victory deserves to be recognized. Thank you for listening to Olivia Stories Revenge. Take care of your boundaries and take care of yourselves. The fire in the cast iron stove burns down to a soft, glowing ember, casting long, wavering shadows across the living room floor. My twins are fast asleep in their nursery, the rhythmic rise and fall of their tiny chests serving as the quiet heartbeat of this house. Sitting here in the profound stillness of the North Dakota winter, surrounded by the physical and financial fortress I constructed to keep them safe, I often find myself reflecting not on the war that was won, but on the profound responsibility of the peace that follows. The story of the $22 million trust, the federal indictments, and the spectacular collapse of the Sterling Empire is a tale of survival and strategic boundaries. But beneath the surface of the frozen bank accounts and the forged legal documents lies a much deeper, far more critical narrative. It is a story about the absolute necessity of intentional parenting, the true meaning of family responsibility, and the terrifying consequences of raising children without a fundamental compass of honesty and fairness. When I look back at my mother-in-law Victoria and my ex-husband Julian, I do not just see white-collar criminals. I see the catastrophic result of a deeply flawed approach to family legacy. In traditional American culture, we often celebrate the accumulation of wealth and the passing down of generational prosperity. We build businesses, we buy homes, and we lay down financial safety nets, all with the noble intention of giving our children a better life than the one we inherited. But Victoria forgot the most crucial element of that cultural promise. She believed that providing for her son meant shielding him from every conceivable consequence. By using her massive fortune to buy Julian's way out of every mistake she did, not build a strong, capable man. She actively engineered a coward. She raised a son who viewed morality as a commodity that could be purchased and discarded at will. Julian never learned the value of hard work, the stinging but necessary pain of accountability, or the quiet dignity of owning up to a failure. His emotional awareness was stunted, permanently, arrested in a state of childish entitlement because his mother taught him that power was derived from a bank account rather than from personal integrity. As I raise my son and daughter, the lessons extracted from the wreckage of their father's family serve as my daily parenting manifesto. I am the sole guardian of an incredibly massive financial trust, but I am acutely aware that money without character is nothing more than a loaded weapon in the hands of an infant. True family responsibility is not about clearing all the obstacles from your child's path. It is about equipping them with the resilience, the honesty, and the emotional awareness required to climb over those obstacles themselves. Raising children within a traditional, loving family structure requires a foundation built entirely on truth. I want my twins to understand the profound value of fairness. When they are old enough to comprehend the world, they will not be handed platinum credit cards and told they are untouchable. They will learn how to earn their keep. They will be taught to respect the people around them, regardless of their socioeconomic status. I want them to know that the most valuable thing they will ever possess is their given word, and that a signature on a piece of paper represents a binding piece of their soul, not just a legal maneuver. Emotional awareness is the silent cornerstone of this endeavor. Children absorb the invisible frequencies of their environment. If they are raised in a household where manipulation is rewarded and vulnerability is punished, they will inevitably grow up to be predators or prey. I am actively cultivating an environment where my children are allowed to feel, to fail, and to express their fears without the threat of conditional love hanging over their heads. I want my son to know that true masculinity is rooted in protection, accountability, and quiet strength, not in the loud, frantic bullying his biological father displayed. I want my daughter to know that her worth is inherent, unshakable, and completely independent of the men who might try to define her. We live in a modern American society that frequently blurs the lines between success and ruthlessness. It is incredibly easy to lose your moral bearing when the culture consistently rewards those who cut corners and exploit the vulnerable. But the long-term guidance of a child requires a stubborn, relentless commitment to doing what is right, even when it is terrifyingly difficult. The $22 million sitting in that diversified trust is not a free pass to a life of idle luxury. It is an educational tool. It is a resource that will be deployed strategically to help them build their own dreams, fund their own educations, and contribute meaningfully to their communities. They will learn that true wealth is not measured by the ability to control others, but by the ability to control oneself. If you are navigating the incredibly complex, often exhausting journey of raising children in a world that constantly challenges your core values, you are not alone. It takes profound courage to break toxic generational cycles and plant the seeds of honesty and fairness in soil that was previously poisoned by entitlement. If you find strength in these reflections and believe in the power of holding the line for the sake of the next generation, please follow and subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge. We share these narratives not just to expose the darkness, but to fiercely celebrate the light that follows when ordinary people decide to say, enough is enough. As the winter night deepens, I look out the window into the swirling, blinding snow. The storm outside is chaotic, erratic, and utterly indifferent to the lives it disrupts. It reminds me so much of the family I left behind. We can build the strongest walls, install the most secure locks, and set up the most sophisticated financial trusts to protect our children from the cold. We can teach them the difference between right and wrong, and we can model the quiet dignity of a life lived with integrity. But eventually the snow will melt. The years will pass with a terrifying, unrelenting speed. My twins will grow from crawling infants into walking, thinking, independent adults. They will eventually step out the front door and walk out into the vast, unpredictable world, carrying nothing but the internal compass I am desperately trying to calibrate for them right now. I have given them the absolute best foundation I possibly could. I have balanced the ledgers and cleared away the rot. Yet as every parent ultimately discovers in the quiet hours of the night, there is a haunting, beautiful ambiguity to it all. You can write the perfect blueprint, but you cannot force them to follow it. One day they will reach their own crossroads. They will be handed their own manila folders, and they will face their own glittering, dangerous temptations. And in that solitary moment, long after my job is done, I can only sit back and wonder, what will they choose to sign?